Good evening and welcome back to the Sleepy History channel. Here, history is not hurried. It's allowed to slow its pace, to breathe softly, and to settle into the stillness of night. Tonight, we'll be drifting through the lives of those without shelter in medieval times. A world shaped quietly by poverty, exclusion, and the thin line between survival and disappearance, where time moved differently and stories lingered long after voices fell silent. This is not a tale meant to demand your attention. It's a quiet companion, something to listen to as the day loosens its grip and the mind begins to rest. If you feel comfortable, you're always welcome to leave a gentle trace below, where you're listening from tonight, or a story, place, or forgotten age you'd like us to wander through someday. I read every message, and many of these journeys begin with your words. If these calm passages through history speak to you, a soft subscription or a simple like helps this quiet space continue to exist. Now, allow yourself to settle in. Let the hush of medieval towns, roads, and fields surround you. Our journey begins as the familiar charm fades, and we notice those living beyond the warmth of hearth and home. Picture in your mind's eye a bustling medieval town. Thatched roof cottages line narrow, muddy lanes. The air is filled with the clanging of the blacksmith's hammer, the clucking of chickens, and the cries of street vendors hawking their wares. Towering over it all is the great stone church, its bell tolling the hours of the day. But amidst this quaint charm, a shadow lurks. For not everyone in this world has a cozy hearth to call home. In the alleyways and hovels, in the fields and forests, are the forgotten ones, the homeless and destitute. Theirs is a harsh existence, a daily struggle for survival in a world that has cast them aside. It is their story we will explore tonight, dear listener. Through their eyes, we will witness the grim realities of homelessness in an age without safety nets or sympathy. We will see their ingenuity and resilience in the face of adversity. And perhaps, in the flickering candlelight of their tales, we may find some glimmer of our common humanity across the ages. So make yourself comfortable, dear friend, and let us step back in time together. Back to an era when to be homeless was to live on the very margins of existence. Back to medieval Europe. Our scene opens on a blustery autumn day in the year of our Lord, 1348. The Black Death is ravaging the continent, leaving terror and devastation in its wake. Fields lie fallow as farmers take ill and die. City streets are ghostly quiet, the only sound the rumbling of the corpse cart making its grim rounds. On the outskirts of London, a ragged band of homeless folks huddles around a tiny fire, seeking what meagre warmth and fellowship they can find. Among them is John, a gaunt man with haunted eyes. Once a prosperous merchant, John lost everything when the plague claimed his wife and children. With his home and livelihood gone, he took to the streets, joining the growing ranks of the dispossessed. As John pokes at the fire with a stick, his thoughts turn to the cruel twist of fate that brought him here. In the span of a few short months, his life has unraveled completely. The future that once seemed so bright and certain now stretches before him as a bleak wasteland. He wonders how much more loss and hardship he can endure. Muffled coughs and groans from John's companions shake him from his reverie. With a heavy sigh, he pulls his threadbare cloak tighter around his shoulders and tries to push away the gnawing hunger in his belly. There will be no relief today. The city authorities have once again ordered the homeless to be driven out, fearful they may be spreading the pestilence. John knows they will have to move on by nightfall, seeking some new corner of forgotten land where they can lay their heads. it is a weary cycle he has grown accustomed to these past months on the streets. The endless search for shelter, for sustenance, for some shred of human decency in a world turned cold. As the sun begins its slow descent, John rises stiffly to his feet. It is time to begin the next leg of this grim journey. Picking up his few tattered belongings, he turns his steps toward the city gates and the lonely road beyond. Behind him, his ramshackle community slowly disbands, each soul drifting off to face the trials of the night alone. Such was the fate of London's homeless in that dark autumn of the plague year. But their story was not unique. Across medieval Europe, in hovels and hedgerows, in alleys and fields, countless others like John fought each day to survive in the face of poverty, hunger, disease, and scorn. How did they come to such straits? What daily indignities and dangers did they face? And what slim shreds of light punctuated the bleakness of their existence? These are the questions that will guide us as we make our way through this hidden history. But fear not, gentle listener. Ours will be a quiet, measured journey, meandering like a pilgrim through the landscapes of the distant past. So, as the day's final light fades and the candles burn low, let your mind drift back with me to a time long ago, when to have no home was to live ever at the mercy of an unforgiving world. Medieval Europe was a place of extremes, where splendor and squalor existed side by side. For every grand cathedral or gleaming castle, there were a dozen hovels and shanties housing the poorest of the poor. It was a world in which the divide between the haves and have-nots was stark and often brutally enforced. To be homeless in this hierarchical, feudal society was to be branded as an outcast, a pariah, a threat to the social order. Without land, without lineage, without the protection of a lord, the homeless person was seen as a rootless vagabond, a potential criminal or rebel who refused to know their place. In the eyes of the privileged classes, they were a symptom of social breakdown, an affront to the God-given order of things. This prejudice was codified in law and custom throughout the medieval world. In England, a series of statutes from the 14th century onward prescribed harsh punishments for those caught wandering or begging without permission. The accused could be publicly whipped, pilloried, even branded with hot irons as a sign of their low status. Similar laws existed on the continent, from the French kingdom to the German states to the Italian city republics. To be homeless was in effect to be criminalized, a status that brought with it a host of daily dangers and indignities. For those who fell into this abyss, whether through ill fortune, illness, or social upheaval, life became a constant battle for the basics of survival. Food, shelter, safety. These were precious commodities, won only through wit and wile, through begging and scavenging, through constant movement to stay one step ahead of the authorities. We can glimpse something of their struggle in the surviving records of the time, in the court rolls and church registers, in the literature and artwork that occasionally took the homeless as its subject. Though the evidence is fragmentary, often distorted through the lens of the literate elites, it nonetheless paints a picture of a hard, precarious existence lived always on the margins. Take, for example, the case of Agnes Pardner, a homeless woman who appears in the court records of London in 1301. Agnes was arrested for the crime of being a night walker, that is, for daring to move about the city after curfew without a fixed abode. In her testimony, recorded by the court scribe, Agnes pleads for mercy. She explains that she is a widow with 2 small children, forced onto the streets after the death of her husband, a labourer. With no family to take her in and no means of support, Agnes had no choice but to beg by day and seek what furtive shelter she could find by night, always fearing arrest. Her story was a common one, echoed in countless variations across the urban centres of Europe. For the homeless widow, the orphaned child, the crippled veteran, the leper cast out by fearful neighbours, The streets were a last resort, a perilous refuge from a world that had no place for them. How did they survive in the face of such adversity? What small comforts or fleeting joys lightened their burdens? As we sift through the historical record, we can catch glimmers of their resilience, their ingenuity, their quiet fortitude in the face of a hostile world. We see it in the makeshift shelters they built on the edges of towns, lean-tos of scavenged wood and thatch, nestled in the spaces between buildings or in abandoned lots. We see it in the begging bowls they carved from gourds or fashioned from clay, vessels for the alms that were their lifeblood. We see it in the songs and stories they shared around guttering fires, tales of better times and brighter places, of saints and heroes who looked with pity on the poor. And we see it in the fragile communities they built in the midst of their wanderings, bands of outcasts who looked out for one another, sharing what meager food and warmth they could muster. These are the hidden histories we will trace in the hours ahead as the night deepens and the world grows hushed. Through the eyes of the medieval homeless, we will contemplate the extremes of the human condition, the cruelty and callousness of which we are capable, but also the compassion and fellowship without which we cannot survive. So let us gather close now, you and I, as the wind whispers secrets of ages past. Let us open our hearts to these long-forgotten lives, these distant mirrors of our own fears and hopes. And in their faded footsteps, perhaps we may find some echo of our common path as wanderers on this fragile earth. As the chill of night descends and the last embers fade in the fire pits, huddled figures can be seen scattered in the shadows. Wrapped in tattered cloaks, they seek what meager shelter they can. A dry spot beneath a bridge, an abandoned shed, or merely the lee side of a stone wall to break the wind. These are the homeless of medieval Europe, and their plight was a grim one indeed. Life on the streets in the Middle Ages was a relentless struggle for survival. The fortunate ones might find a sympathetic soul to take them in for a night or a scrap of food to quiet their grumbling bellies. But for most, each day brought only gnawing hunger, biting cold, and the constant threat of disease or violence. It's hard to imagine the depths of suffering they endured. One such soul was a man named Thomas. Records from a 14th century London court tell his story in terse, unfeeling lines of ink. Thomas was a labourer, but an injury left him unable to work. With no family to turn to and no means to support himself, he was cast out onto the streets. Night after night, he huddled in a doorway, his only warmth a small fire kindled from bits of scavenged wood. The court record notes that Thomas was arrested for vagrancy and begging. The penalty was a public whipping to deter others from such idleness. One can almost feel the sting of the lash and hear the jeers of the crowd as this broken man was punished for the crime of poverty. Such was the callousness of the age towards those who had fallen through the cracks. Thomas was just one of a multitude of homeless in medieval England. It's estimated that as much as half the population lived on the knife's edge of destitution. A single failed harvest or bout of illness could be all it took to plunge a family from subsistence into homelessness. And once on the streets, it was fiendishly hard to claw one's way back out. This precariousness was woven into the very fabric of medieval society. The feudal system that governed much of Europe was a rigid hierarchy, with the wealthy elite at the top and the landless poor at the bottom. For the homeless, there was no lower rung on the ladder to sink to. They were the disregarded refuse of a system that had no place for them. Adding to their misery were the frequent wars, plagues and famines that ravaged the land. Invading armies would burn and pillage, sending waves of refugees fleeing from the destruction. The Black Death snuffed out millions of lives, leaving ghost towns in its wake and orphaned children wandering the roads. And when the harvests failed, and starvation stalked the land, it was always the poorest who suffered most. Through it all, the homeless persevered as best they could. Some banded together for safety and companionship, forming makeshift communities on the edges of towns. They erected lean-tos from cast-off planks and huddled around campfires to ward off the chill. It was a hard, hand-to-mouth existence, but at least they had each other. One such community sprang up outside the walls of Paris in the 15th century. Called the Court of Miracles, it was a sprawling encampment that was home to hundreds of beggars, thieves, and drifters. By day, they fanned out into the city to ply their trades. Some with legitimately, others less so. But by night, they returned to their ramshackle village, a place beyond the reach of the authorities. The court took its ironic name from the supposed miracles that occurred there each evening. Beggars who had feigned disability and infirmity all day would cast off their bandages and crutches, revealing themselves to be hale and hearty. There was a grim practicality to this deception. A healthy beggar would garner little sympathy, so they played the part of the afflicted to loosen the purse strings of the pious. It's easy to condemn their deceptions and rough living, but faced with a world that had turned its back on them, the denizens of the Court of Miracles made their own way as best they could. Theirs was a life lived on the fringes, in the shadows and gutters of society. And if they sometimes strayed across the hard lines of the law, perhaps it was only what their hard circumstances demanded. Unfortunately, even these meagre refugees were not to last. As the homeless population swelled, so too did the hostility against them. Towns began to crack down, seeing them as a blight and a threat to public order. Raids were carried out to clear away their encampments, scattering the inhabitants back out onto the streets. In 1453, the Court of Miracles was torched to the ground on orders of the king. The inhabitants were rounded up, the able-bodied pressed into military service, the infirm driven out of the city. It was a scene repeated across Europe as the powerful sought to sweep the homeless problem out of sight. For those who could no longer endure the privations of the streets, the monastery or convent offered a final refuge. By taking holy orders, they could secure a roof over their head and a simple meal each day. It was not an easy life, one of prayer, service, and self-denial. But for some, it was preferable to the gnawing destitution they had known. One such soul was 𝐼𝐻𝐻𝐼𝐻𝐻𝐿. Born into a wealthy family, she had known all the comforts of privilege. But mental illness and a call to religious devotion led her to cast off her worldly possessions and take up the life of a mendicant pilgrim. For years, she wandered the roads of England and Europe, relying on the charity of strangers for her daily bread. Exhausted in both body and spirit, Marjorie eventually found solace in a convent. There, among the quiet rhythms of the religious life, she found a measure of the peace and stability that had long eluded her. Her story speaks to the desperation of the medieval homeless, that even the strictures of the cloister were preferable to the hardships of the streets. As we look back on these hard tales from a distant age, it's tempting to think that we've moved beyond such callousness and deprivation, but the spectre of homelessness still haunts us to this day. In our own cities, we still see huddled forms in doorways, ragged figures pouring through the trash for a morsel to eat. Perhaps in their faces, we can catch a glimpse of Thomas the Beggar or the exiles of the Court of Miracles. Their suffering may be softened by modern social programs and charities, but the basic contours of their struggle remain the same. It is a hard thing to be without hearth or home. So as we drift off to sleep this night, in the comfort of our warm beds, let us spare a thought for those who came before us. The homeless of medieval Europe may be dust and memory now, but their pain and perseverance still speaks across the centuries. In remembering their stories, we keep a small candle burning for the dispossessed of every age. And in so doing, perhaps we fan the flames of compassion for those in need in our own time. As the flickering candlelight illuminated the worn faces huddled together for warmth, it was clear that this makeshift camp offered little respite from the bitter cold. Tattered cloaks and threadbare blankets did little to shield them from the biting wind that whipped through the narrow alleyways. This was the stark reality for the homeless souls eking out a meagre existence in the shadow of the grand cathedral looming overhead. While the towering spires and ornate stained glass stood as a testament to the wealth and power of the church, down here at the margins of society, life was a daily struggle for survival. The lucky ones might receive a crust of bread or a bowl of thin gruel from the monastery kitchens, but such charity was sporadic and always insufficient to sate the gnawing hunger. One such unfortunate was a young woman named Agnes. Left destitute after the death of her husband in the last round of feudal conflict, she had taken to the streets with her 2 small children in tow. As Agnes cradled her baby close to her chest, she couldn't help but wonder what sins she must have committed to deserve such a wretched fate. Surely, this was a punishment from the Almighty for her wickedness. But Agnes was far from alone in her suffering. Everywhere you looked, the signs of deprivation and despair were etched upon the faces of the dispossessed. Sunken eyes peered out from dirt-smeared faces, and skeletal limbs poked out from under ragged smocks. The stench of unwashed bodies and festering sores mingled with the ever-present odor of human waste that filled the gutters. It's hard for us to imagine the sheer scale of homelessness in the Middle Ages. Conservative estimates suggest that in some towns and cities, as much as half the population lacked any sort of permanent shelter. The ranks of the homeless were swelled by a perfect storm of factors, from the ceaseless warfare that ravaged the countryside to the frequent famines that left whole villages starving. But perhaps the biggest driver of homelessness was the oppressive system of feudalism that governed medieval society. Under this hierarchy, the vast majority of people were effectively bound to the land, forced to toil for their noble masters in exchange for a meagre subsistence. When the crops failed, or the lord demanded extra tithes, many peasants were left with no choice but to abandon their homes and take to the road in search of a better life. Of course, that better life often proved elusive. Medieval towns were not exactly welcoming places for the dispossessed. Vagrancy was viewed as a crime, and those caught begging or sleeping rough were subject to severe punishments, from flogging to imprisonment in the stocks. For a glimpse of just how precarious life could be for the medieval homeless, we can look to the harrowing story of Thomas Weston. Born into a humble peasant family, Thomas had the misfortune of coming of age during the Great Famine that struck England in the early 14th century. As the crops withered in the fields and food prices soared, Thomas and his family were forced to abandon their small plot of land and seek alms in the nearby town of Bristol. But their timing could not have been worse. The town was already teeming with desperate souls driven from the countryside, and the authorities were in no mood for mercy. Thomas and his elderly father were arrested for begging and sentenced to a day in the stocks. As they sat there, exposed to the jeers and insults of the townsfolk, Thomas's father succumbed to his hunger and exhaustion, slumping over dead in the afternoon sun. Thomas would spend the next 3 years living hand to mouth on the streets, dodging the watchful eyes of the constables and fighting off starvation with whatever scraps he could scrounge. But even Thomas's wretched existence paled in comparison to the horrors that would soon be visited upon England's homeless population. In the summer of 1348, the first wave of the Black Death reached the island's shores, carried by fleas on the rats that infested the squalid camps and hovels of the poor. The plague tore through the tightly packed homeless encampments like wildfire, killing indiscriminately and without mercy. The fortunate ones died quickly, their ravaged bodies piled onto carts and hauled away to mass graves beyond the city walls. But for those who lingered on in agony, there was little comfort or respite. Most hospitals and religious houses refused to take in the homeless sick, fearing that they carried the contagion, and so they were left to die in the gutters, their pitiful moans echoing through the empty streets as the wealthier townsfolk shuttered their windows and prayed for deliverance. By the time the plague had burned itself out, as much as half of England's population had perished, with the homeless bearing the brunt of the losses. In London alone, it's estimated that over 20,000 homeless people died during the outbreak, their emaciated corpses left to rot where they fell. For the medieval homeless, death was an ever-present spectre, stalking the fetid alleyways and squalid encampments where they struggled to survive. If the cold or the hunger didn't claim them, then disease almost certainly would. And even if by some miracle they managed to avoid these perils, there was always the risk of violence at the hands of the authorities or their fellow outcasts. Given the constant dangers and deprivations they faced, it's little wonder that many homeless people in the Middle Ages sought refuge in the one institution that promised some measure of comfort and stability: the church. For all its flaws and hypocrisies, the medieval church did offer a glimmer of hope to the dispossessed. Monasteries and convents often provided food and shelter to the destitute, and some religious orders, such as the Franciscans, made aiding the poor a central part of their mission. For a lucky few, joining a religious order offered an escape from the vicious cycle of poverty and homelessness. Take the tale of Elizabeth, a homeless widow who found salvation through service to God. Left penniless after the death of her husband, Elizabeth wandered the countryside for years, begging for alms and sleeping in barns and haystacks. But her life took a turn when she stumbled upon a small convent in the woods outside of York. The nuns took pity on the ragged woman and offered her a place to stay in exchange for help with the daily chores. Over time, Elizabeth found a sense of purpose and belonging in the rhythms of religious life, and she eventually took the veil herself, dedicating her remaining years to prayer and service. Of course, Elizabeth's story was the exception rather than the rule. For every homeless person who found solace in the church, countless others were left to fend for themselves on the margins of society. And even those who did find a place in a monastery or convent often faced harsh discipline and a life of grinding poverty and toil. So what are we to make of this tragic history of medieval homelessness? What lessons can we draw from the suffering of these long-dead outcasts? Perhaps the most obvious one is that poverty and homelessness are not new problems, born of modern inequality or social decay. They have been with us for centuries, scars on the face of every so-called civilized society. But more than that, the stories of people like Agnes, Thomas, and Elizabeth remind us of the fundamental humanity of the homeless. They were not faceless statistics or social problems to be solved, but real people with hopes, dreams, and desires just like our own. In a world that often seems indifferent to the suffering of the poor and the marginalized, it's easy to look away, to pretend that their struggles have nothing to do with us. But the history of medieval homelessness reminds us that we are all connected, all part of the same human family. As we huddle together against the cold and the dark, let us remember the homeless souls who came before us, and let their stories kindle in us a spark of compassion and solidarity. For in the end, there is no us and them, no deserving and undeserving poor. There is only us, struggling and dreaming together beneath the same indifferent stars. As the chill of night settled over the city, the makeshift hovels and crude shelters of the homeless came to eerie life. Shadows flickered across tattered cloth and salvaged wood, cast by the fading embers of cooking fires. Huddled figures stirred beneath threadbare blankets, their breath misting in the cold air. For the destitute of medieval Europe, each night was a battle against the elements, and a fervent prayer to see the dawn. One such figure was a young girl named Agnes. Orphaned by the plague and cast out by her relatives, Agnes had joined the ranks of the homeless at the tender age of 7. Now, at 12, she was a veteran of the streets, wise beyond her years. As she curled up beneath a lean-to fashioned from an abandoned cart, Agnes's stomach growled with hunger. It had been 2 days since her last proper meal, a crust of bread and a few scraps of salted fish, begged from a kind-hearted merchant. Food was a constant struggle for the homeless of the Middle Ages. With no reliable source of income, they were forced to rely on the charity of others or resort to desperate measures. Begging was a common sight on the streets of medieval towns, with the destitute pleading for scraps and alms. However, as the numbers of homeless grew, so too did the laws against vagrancy and loitering. Many towns imposed harsh punishments on those caught begging, from public floggings to imprisonment in the stocks. For young Agnes, the risk of arrest was a daily reality. She had learned to be quick and cunning, darting through the crowds with her hand outstretched, then disappearing into the labyrinth of alleyways before the authorities could catch her. On a good day, she might collect a few copper coins, enough to buy a meagre meal. But on a bad day, when the merchants turned their backs and the townsfolk hurried past, Agnes was forced to seek out other options. One such option was scavenging. The streets and gutters of medieval cities were littered with refuse, from rotting vegetables to discarded bones. For the desperate, this detritus could mean the difference between life and death. Agnes had become an expert at picking through the garbage, seeking out morsels that were still edible. She had learned which taverns threw out the best scraps and which back alleys were home to the most bountiful dung heaps. But even scavenging had its risks. Competition among the homeless was fierce, and fights over particularly choice bits of refuse were not uncommon. Agnes bore the scars of such conflicts, a jagged wound across her cheek from a rival's makeshift blade. She had learned to be fast and vicious, striking first and showing no mercy. In the world of the medieval homeless, compassion was a luxury few could afford. As Agnes curled tighter beneath her thin blanket, her thoughts turned to the coming day. She would rise with the sun and begin her daily rounds, scouring the streets for any opportunity to fill her belly. Perhaps the baker would be in a generous mood, or a passing nobleman might toss a coin in her direction. Or perhaps she would be forced to take more desperate measures, risking the wrath of the law for a chance at survival. For now, though, Agnes allowed herself a moment of rest. The night was cold and the ground was hard, but for a few precious hours, she could escape the gnawing hunger and the constant fear. In her dreams, she was warm and safe, with a full belly and a roof over her head. It was a fleeting fantasy, but it was enough to carry her through to another dawn. As Agnes drifted off to sleep, her story was just one of countless others playing out across medieval Europe. For the homeless of this era, life was a constant struggle, a daily battle against hunger, disease, and despair. But even in the darkest of times, there were glimmers of hope, moments of kindness and compassion that reminded them of their shared humanity. One such moment came in the form of a wandering friar, a man named Brother Luc. Born to a wealthy family in southern France, Luc had renounced his worldly possessions and taken a vow of poverty, dedicating his life to serving the poor and the sick. As he traveled the roads of Europe, he witnessed firsthand the suffering of the homeless and was moved to action. In each town he visited, Brother Luc sought out the most destitute and downtrodden, offering them not just food and alms, but also spiritual comfort and guidance. He listened to their stories and offered prayers for their well-being, treating them with a dignity and respect that was all too rare in medieval society. For Agnes, Brother Luc was a beacon of hope in a bleak world. She had first encountered him on a particularly desperate day, when hunger and exhaustion had left her curled up in a doorway, too weak to move. The friar had knelt beside her, offering her a sip of water and a gentle touch on the shoulder. He had stayed with her for hours, telling her stories of the saints and the love of God, until she had found the strength to sit up and accept the bread he offered. From that day forward, Agnes looked for Brother Luke whenever he passed through her town. She would seek him out in the market square or outside the church, eager for a kind word and a moment of human connection. The friar always greeted her with a smile and a blessing, pressing a coin or a crust of bread into her palm. But Brother Luke's kindness extended beyond just material aid. He also offered Agnes and the other homeless a sense of spiritual nourishment, a reminder that they were not forgotten or forsaken by God. In a world that saw them as little more than vermin, the friar treated them as children of the divine, worthy of love and compassion. One day, as Brother Luke was preparing to leave town, he took Agnes aside and pressed a small wooden cross into her hand. "Keep this with you, my child," he said, his eyes full of warmth. "Let it remind you that you are never alone, and that God's love is always with you." Agnes clutched the cross tightly, feeling its rough edges dig into her palm. It was a small thing, just a simple piece of wood, but to her it was a treasure beyond measure. In a life filled with uncertainty and hardship, it was a tangible reminder of hope, a symbol of the kindness and compassion that could still be found in the darkest of places. As Brother Luke walked away, disappearing into the crowded streets, Agnes felt a sudden pang of loss. The friar had been a bright spot in her bleak existence, a source of comfort and strength. But she knew that his mission was bigger than just one homeless girl, that there were countless others who needed his help and guidance. Clutching the wooden cross to her chest, Agnes whispered a silent prayer for Brother Luke's safety and well-being. She prayed that he would continue to bring light and hope to the dark corners of the world, and that his example would inspire others to act with kindness and compassion. As the sun began to set over the town, Agnes set out in search of a place to sleep. The streets were already filling with shadows, and the chill of night was creeping in. But for the first time in a long while, Agnes felt a flicker of something like hope in her heart. The road ahead was long and uncertain, but she knew that she was not alone. With Brother Luke's cross in her hand and his words in her heart, she had the strength to face whatever lay ahead. Agnes's story, like so many others, was a testament to the resilience and courage of the medieval homeless. In a world that offered them little more than scorn and neglect, they found ways to survive and even thrive, relying on their wits, their resourcefulness, and their unshakable sense of human dignity. It was a lesson that would echo down through the centuries, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there is always room for hope and compassion. And as the homeless of the Middle Ages faded into history, their stories would live on, a testament to the enduring strength of the human spirit. For Brother Luke, the plight of the homeless was more than just a calling. It was a sacred duty, a mission that he had sworn to fulfill with every fibre of his being. As he walked the roads of Europe, he carried with him not just his meagre possessions, but also the weight of countless lives, the hopes and dreams of the destitute and the forgotten. In each town he visited, Brother Luke sought out the most wretched and forlorn, those who had been cast aside by society and left to fend for themselves. He found them huddled in doorways and alleys, shivering beneath tattered blankets and scraps of cloth. He saw the hunger in their eyes and the despair in their hearts, and he knew that he could not turn away. With a gentle touch and a kind word, Brother Luke would kneel beside them, offering what comfort and solace he could. He would share with them his own meagre rations, breaking bread and sipping water from his own flask. And he would listen to their stories, bearing witness to their pain and their sorrow. Many of the homeless he encountered were victims of circumstance, cast out by a cruel and unforgiving world. Some had lost their homes to war or famine, while others had been driven from their villages by plague or persecution. Still others had been born into poverty, never knowing the warmth of a hearth or the comfort of a full belly. But no matter their origins or their circumstances, Brother Luke saw in each of them a spark of the divine, a glimmer of the God who had created them in his own image. He knew that they were not defined by their poverty or their misfortune, but by the unquenchable fire of their human spirit. And so, he ministered to them, not just with bread and water, but with the balm of human kindness. He listened to their fears and their sorrows, offering words of comfort and encouragement. He prayed with them and for them, calling down the blessings of heaven upon their weary heads. In the face of so much suffering and despair, it would have been easy for Brother Luke to lose heart, to succumb to the darkness that seemed to press in from all sides. But he clung to his faith like a lifeline, drawing strength from the conviction that God's love was stronger than any earthly sorrow. And so he pressed on, day after day, town after town, carrying the light of hope into the darkest corners of the world. He knew that his mission was a humble one, that he could not hope to solve the vast and intractable problem of medieval homelessness. But he also knew that every act of kindness, no matter how small, was a victory in the battle against despair. As the years passed and his own strength began to fail, Brother Luke never wavered in his commitment to the poor and the destitute. Even as his body grew frail and his steps faltered, he continued to seek out those in need, to offer them the comfort of his presence and the warmth of his heart. And when at last he lay upon his deathbed, surrounded by the brothers of his order, Brother Luke's thoughts turned once more to the homeless he had served so faithfully. With his last breath, he whispered a prayer for their well-being, entrusting them to the care of a loving God. Brother Luke's legacy would live on long after his passing, inspiring generations of monks and nuns to follow in his footsteps. They would take up his mantle of service to the poor, carrying the light of compassion into the darkest corners of medieval Europe. And though the problem of homelessness would persist, an intractable scourge that defied easy solutions, the example of Brother Luke and those like him would stand as a reminder of the power of human kindness. In a world that so often seemed cold and unforgiving, their selfless devotion to the least among us was a beacon of hope, a testament to the enduring strength of the human spirit. For the homeless of the Middle Ages, life was a daily struggle against hunger, disease, and despair. Cast out by a society that saw them as little more than refuse, they were forced to rely on their own wits and resourcefulness to survive. But even in the darkest of times, there were glimmers of hope, moments of grace that reminded them of their inherent worth and dignity. In the flickering light of a beggar's fire, in the shared warmth of a makeshift shelter, in the gentle touch of a compassionate hand, they found the strength to carry on. And in the stories of those like Agnes and Brother Luke, they found a reason to believe in the possibility of a better world. As we look back on the plight of the medieval homeless, it is easy to feel a sense of despair, to wonder how a society could have failed so many of its most vulnerable members. But we must also remember the lessons of those who refused to turn away, who saw in the face of the destitute a reflection of their own humanity. In our own time, as we grapple with the ongoing crisis of homelessness in our cities and towns, we would do well to remember the example of Brother Luke and those like him. We may not be able to solve the problem overnight, but we can each do our part to alleviate the suffering of those in need. Whether it is through volunteering at a local shelter, donating to a food bank, or simply offering a kind word or a helping hand to someone in distress, we all have the power to make a difference. And in doing so, we honor the memory of those who came before us, those who refused to let the darkness win. As we close this chapter on the homeless of the Middle Ages, let us carry their stories with us, a reminder of the resilience and courage of the human spirit. And let us pledge ourselves to building a world in which no one is left behind, in which every person is treated with the dignity and compassion they deserve. In the words of Brother Luke, we are all children of God, worthy of love and respect. May we never forget the least among us, and may we always strive to be a light in the darkness. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the muddy streets, the town of Ipswich settled into an uneasy quiet. Shopkeepers shuttered their windows, children were ushered inside, and the respectable folk retired for the evening. But for the town's homeless and destitute, the struggle was only beginning. Huddled in a dark alley, a group of ragged figures gathered around a meagre fire, their faces gaunt and haunted in the flickering light. Among them was John, a once proud craftsman who had fallen on hard times. His calloused hands trembled as he warmed them over the flames, his empty stomach growling in protest. John's story was a familiar one in medieval England. A sudden illness had left him unable to work, and without a trade or family to support him, he had quickly found himself cast out onto the streets. In a society with no safety net or social services, losing one's livelihood often meant losing everything. As John surveyed his companions, he saw a grim cross-section of medieval misfortune. There was Agnes, an elderly widow with no children to care for her, Thomas, a lame beggar with a withered leg, and Mary, a young mother clutching a sickly infant to her breast. They were just a few of the countless souls left to fend for themselves in a world that had no place for them. Ipswich was far from unique in its homeless problem. Across England and Europe, towns and cities were grappling with a growing tide of poverty and destitution. It was a crisis born of many factors: endless wars that disrupted trade and agriculture, periodic famines that left whole regions starving, and the rigid hierarchies of feudal society that concentrated wealth in the hands of a few. In the 14th century, the situation was made even worse by the arrival of the Black Death. The devastating plague wiped out up to half the population in some areas, leaving behind a landscape of abandoned villages and desperate survivors. Many who had once lived comfortable lives found themselves suddenly cast into poverty, their lands seized by lords and their families scattered to the winds. For the homeless of Ipswich, the struggle was one of day-to-day survival. With no permanent shelter, they were at the mercy of the elements, huddling under bridges or in abandoned barns to escape the worst of the cold and rain. In the summer, they might camp in the woods or fields outside of town, only to be chased off by angry landowners or roving bandits. Food was an even greater challenge. With no means to earn an honest living, many were forced to rely on begging or scavenging for scraps. In a pinch, some might resort to petty theft, risking harsh punishments if caught. Even in the best of times, a homeless person's diet was meager and monotonous, consisting mostly of coarse bread, thin soup, and whatever wild plants or animals they could forage. The constant spectre of hunger took a heavy toll, weakening the body and making it susceptible to a host of maladies. For the homeless, even a simple cut or chill could quickly escalate into a life-threatening condition. Without access to proper medical care, they were easy prey for the many diseases that ran rampant in medieval towns: dysentery, typhoid fever, tuberculosis, and more. Perhaps the greatest suffering, though, was inflicted by their fellow man. To be homeless in medieval England was to exist on the very lowest rung of society, scorned and shunned as a pariah. Town authorities saw them as a blight and a nuisance, driving them out with edicts and ordinances. Merchants and tradesmen regarded them with suspicion, guarding their wares from sticky fingers. Even the church, which preached charity and compassion, often viewed them more as a burden than as lost sheep in need of a shepherd. For John and his companions, each day was a waking nightmare of gnawing hunger, biting cold, and constant degradation. They survived from moment to moment, scrounging for food and shelter where they could find it. Some clung to shreds of hope for a better tomorrow, while others had long since abandoned any dreams beyond the next meal or safe place to sleep. As the night wore on and the fire burned low, John pulled his tattered cloak tighter around his shoulders. He wondered what the future held for him and his fellow outcasts. Would they live to see another sunrise, or would they simply fade away, unmourned and unremembered? In the dark corners of medieval society, it was a question that haunted the lives of countless homeless souls. There were some, however, who found an unexpected path out of the gutter. For a lucky few, the rigid hierarchy of feudal society also offered a promise of stability and purpose, if they were willing to leave the world behind entirely. In towns and villages across medieval Europe, monasteries and convents served as bastions of learning, charity, and spiritual devotion. For centuries, they had offered refuge to the poor and the sick, providing food, shelter, and medical care to those in need. Some even operated hospitals and almshouses specifically for the homeless and destitute. For a homeless person with nowhere else to turn, the cloistered life of a monk or nun could be a tempting proposition. Behind the walls of a religious house, they would be guaranteed a roof over their heads, regular meals, and a stable community to belong to. In exchange, they would dedicate their lives to prayer, study, and service to God. Of course, the decision to enter a monastery or convent was not one to be made lightly. The rules and routines of religious life were strict and inflexible, demanding complete obedience and self-denial. Novices were expected to renounce all worldly possessions and ties, surrendering themselves entirely to the will of their superiors. For some, it was a sacrifice too great to bear. But for others, like Margaret, a former beggar who had lost everything in the plague, it was a chance at a new beginning. Margaret had spent years living hand-to-mouth on the streets of London, begging for scraps and sleeping in doorways. When a kind-hearted nun had taken pity on her and offered her a place in the convent, she had leapt at the chance. As a novice, Margaret had struggled at first to adjust to the rigors of religious life. The early morning prayers, the long hours of silent contemplation, the endless rounds of chores and labours. It was all so different from the chaotic hustle of the streets. But gradually, she had found a sense of peace and purpose in the rhythm of the days, a feeling of belonging that she had never known before. For Margaret and others like her, the convent became a true home, a place of safety, community, and spiritual nourishment. They took solace in the knowledge that they were part of something greater than themselves, dedicating their lives to the service of God and their fellow man. But even within the walls of the convent, the spectre of homelessness was never far away. The monasteries and religious houses of medieval Europe were often overwhelmed by the sheer scale of poverty and suffering in their midst. They did their best to provide for the needy, but their resources were limited, and they could only do so much. Moreover, not all religious orders were equally welcoming to the homeless and destitute. Some saw them as a drain on their resources, a distraction from their spiritual mission. Others were more concerned with the social status and connections of their members, favouring the wealthy and well-born over the poor and humble. Even Margaret, who had found a home in the convent, knew that her place there was not guaranteed. She was acutely aware of her lowly origins and the lingering prejudices that followed her even in the cloistered world of the religious. She worked hard to prove herself, to show that she was worthy of the chance she had been given, but always with the fear that it could be taken away at any moment. As the years passed, Margaret rose through the ranks of the convent, taking on increasing responsibilities and earning the respect of her sisters. But even as she found fulfillment in her new life, she never forgot the lessons of her old one. She knew all too well the harsh realities of homelessness, the gnawing hunger and biting cold, the constant struggle to survive in a world that had no place for the poor and the weak. And so, in her own small way, Margaret worked to ease the suffering of those still trapped in that world. She volunteered in the convent's hospital, tending to the sick and the dying with gentle hands and soothing words. She helped to distribute food and clothing to the needy, offering them a moment of respite and a glimmer of hope in their dark and difficult lives. For Margaret, it was a way of giving back, of honoring the kindness and compassion that had been shown to her when she was at her lowest point. And it was a reminder too of the fundamental humanity that bound them all together, rich and poor, high and low, the housed and the homeless. As she made her rounds through the hospital ward, Margaret paused beside the bed of an old man, his face etched with the lines of a hard life. He was a beggar, she knew, one of the many who haunted the streets of the town, scraping by on the meager charity of others. Now, in the twilight of his life, he had come to the convent seeking comfort and care in his final days. Margaret took his hand in hers, feeling the roughness of his calluses, the tremors of age and illness. She smiled down at him, her voice soft and soothing, as she recited a prayer of comfort and peace. For a moment, the old man's eyes flickered open, meeting hers with a look of gratitude and understanding. In that moment, Margaret knew that she had found her true calling, not just as a nun, but as a guardian and protector of the lost and the forgotten. She knew that the road ahead would not be easy, that there would always be more suffering than she could ever hope to alleviate. But she also knew that every small act of kindness, every moment of connection and compassion, made a difference in the lives of those who had nothing else to cling to. As she continued her rounds, Margaret's thoughts turned to the world outside the convent walls, to the hungry and the homeless, the sick and the suffering. She knew that their struggles were far from over, that the harsh realities of medieval life would continue to take their toll. But she also knew that there was hope, too, in the kindness of strangers, in the resilience of the human spirit, and in the enduring power of faith and love. For the homeless of medieval Europe, life was a constant battle against the elements, against hunger and disease, against the callousness and cruelty of their fellow man. But even in the darkest of times, there were glimmers of light, the kindness of a stranger, the comfort of a warm meal, the solace of a prayer whispered in the night. And in the end, perhaps that was the greatest lesson of all, that even in the midst of unimaginable hardship and suffering, the human spirit could endure. That hope could be found in the most unlikely of places, and that compassion could bloom in the harshest of soils. As the sun rose over the town of Ipswich, casting its golden light over the muddy streets and thatched roofs, John and his companions stirred from their slumber. They emerged from their makeshift shelters, blinking in the brightness of the day, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. For some, the struggle would continue. The endless cycle of hunger and hardship, the constant fear of sickness and violence. But for others, like Margaret, a new path had opened up. A chance at a different kind of life, one of purpose and meaning, of service and sacrifice. And though the road ahead was long and uncertain, they walked it with heads held high, secure in the knowledge that they were not alone, that in the darkest of times there was still light to be found. In the warmth of a fire, the touch of a hand, the whispered words of a prayer. For the homeless of medieval Europe, life was a constant struggle. But it was also a testament to the indomitable human spirit, to the resilience and courage of those who refused to be broken, who clung to hope in the face of despair, and who found light in the darkest of places. As the town began to stir to life, the clatter of carts and the chatter of voices filling the air, John and his companions set out once more into the streets. They had survived another night, another day, and for now, that was enough. For in the midst of hardship and suffering, they had found a kind of strength, a sense of community and solidarity that could not be taken away. And though the future was uncertain, though the road ahead was long and hard, they faced it together. The lost and the forgotten, the homeless and the destitute, bound by the shared experience of struggle and survival. It was a bond that transcended time and place. a connection that echoed across the centuries. From the muddy streets of medieval Ipswich to the neon-lit alleys of modern cities. For in the end, the plight of the homeless was a universal one, a reminder of the fragility of the human condition and the enduring power of compassion and hope. And so, as the sun climbed higher in the sky, as the day unfolded in all its joys and sorrows, John and his companions continued on their journey, one step at a time, one day at a time, sustained by the knowledge that they were not alone, that there was still goodness to be found in the world, even in the darkest of times. It was a lesson that would echo through the ages, a reminder that even in the face of unimaginable hardship and suffering, the human spirit could endure, could find hope and meaning in the most unlikely of places. And though the road ahead was long and uncertain, it was a journey worth taking, a testament to the resilience and courage of the human heart. As the plague raged on, decimating entire villages and cities, the homeless bore the brunt of its merciless spread. Crowded together in squalid encampments, with little access to clean water or sanitation, they were like kindling for the flames of pestilence. The Black Death, in particular, cut a swath through the ranks of the destitute with ruthless efficiency. One such tragic tale comes to us from the chronicles of a French monastery in the year 1349. The monks record how a ragged band of homeless families had taken refuge in a nearby field, erecting a pitiful shanty town of lean-tos and hovels. As the plague crept ever closer, the monks took pity on these wretched souls and began bringing them meagre rations of bread and ale. But it was too little, too late. Within days, the makeshift camp had transformed into a grim tableau of suffering and death. The monks described with morbid fascination the black buboes swelling in the sufferers' armpits and groins, the inky blood that seeped from their noses and mouths, the agonized moans that rent the night air. One by one, the homeless succumbed to the pestilence, their bodies dragged into mass graves by the few surviving monks clad in heavy leather cloaks and masks stuffed with sweet-smelling herbs to ward off the miasma. In the end, not a soul was spared from that ill-fated band of vagrants. The Black Death had claimed them all, leaving naught but a scattering of abandoned hovels and the lingering stench of decay. Such was the fate of countless homeless across Europe during the waves of plague that scoured the continent. With no walls to shelter behind or hearth to retreat to, they were like chaff before the reaper's scythe. Even in times of relative health, the spectre of disease haunted the lives of the destitute. Malnutrition left them weak and vulnerable to a host of maladies. The filth and squalor of the streets bred infections and parasites that burrowed into their flesh. A simple cut or scrape could fester and rot, leaving them crippled or disfigured. Chronic afflictions like pneumonia, tuberculosis, and dysentery were constant companions, slowly sapping their strength and will. In the eyes of medieval society, this susceptibility to disease only further stigmatized the homeless as unclean and tainted, their emaciated frames, racking coughs, and pus-ridden sores marked them as pariahs to be avoided lest their contagions spread. Lepers in particular were reviled and ostracized, condemned to a life of begging on the fringes of civilization. The fear of contagion from the homeless reached a fever pitch during times of epidemic. Towns would bar their gates to ragged wanderers, leaving them to languish and die in the ditches beyond the walls. Even the charitable monks and nuns would sometimes shun their sickly charges, dispensing bread and alms with a pole to avoid the taint of their diseased hands. For the destitute of the Middle Ages, each day was a Sisyphean struggle against the ravages of illness and infirmity. With no medicine or care beyond the occasional poultice or prayer, they could only endure the racking pains and wasting fevers as best they could, knowing that their next breath might be their last. It is a grim irony that in death, the homeless finally found a measure of equality with their more fortunate peers. Rich and poor alike were fodder for the plague's insatiable maw. In the charnel pits and mass graves, the bones of princes mingled freely with those of paupers. But even this morbid democracy was short-lived. As the wheels of industry and commerce ground to a halt, the need for cheap labour skyrocketed. Suddenly, the once reviled homeless were seen as a resource to be exploited. Able-bodied vagrants were rounded up and impressed into work gangs, toiling in the fields and mines for a pittance of bread and shelter. Those deemed too weak or infirm to work were simply cast aside, left to die in the gutters and alleyways. In some cases, the destitute were actively persecuted, scapegoated as the cause of the plague by dint of their perceived sinfulness and impurity. Across Europe, homeless encampments were put to the torch, their inhabitants beaten and driven out like mangy dogs. Even in death, the homeless were denied the basic dignities accorded to their wealthier counterparts. While the rich and noble were interred in ornate tombs and sepulchres, the indigent were dumped unceremoniously into unmarked pits, their passing unmourned and unremembered. As the plague burned itself out and life slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy, the plight of the homeless once again faded into the background of medieval society's consciousness. The able-bodied drifted back into the anonymity of itinerant labour, wandering from town to town in search of work and sustenance. The infirm and elderly returned to their familiar haunts in the almshouses and poorhouses, eking out a meagre existence on the charity of the church and the occasional kind-hearted soul. But the scars of the pestilence lingered long in the collective memory of the destitute. For generations, the spectre of plague haunted their dreams and tinged their waking hours with a sense of foreboding. They knew all too well the cruel caprices of fate that could strike down the mightiest lord and the lowliest serf with equal impunity. In many ways, the plight of the homeless in the face of plague was a microcosm of their larger struggle for survival in the harsh and unforgiving world of the Middle Ages. Beset on all sides by hunger, cold, violence, and disease, they scraped and scrabbled for every morsel of food, every scrap of shelter, every shred of human dignity. It is a testament to the indomitable resilience of the human spirit that so many managed to endure in the face of such unrelenting adversity. Against all odds, they found small moments of solace and camaraderie in the shared hardships of the streets. They forged bonds of mutual aid and protection, pooling their meager resources to help the weakest among them survive another day. And in the darkest depths of despair, some even managed to find a flicker of hope and purpose. In the cloistered walls of the monasteries and convents, a lucky few discovered a refuge from the chaos and cruelty of the outside world. Here, they could shed the rags and filth of their former lives and don the simple robes of a monastic order. For these fortunate souls, the regimented routines of prayer, work, and contemplation offered a welcome respite from the daily grind of survival. In the service of a higher power, they found a sense of meaning and belonging that had eluded them in the dog-eat-dog world of the streets. But even within the sanctified halls of the church, the spectre of poverty and want was never far away. Many monasteries and convents struggled to feed and clothe the throngs of homeless that flocked to their gates, straining their meager resources to the breaking point. In some cases, the flood of indigent refugees threatened to overwhelm the very institutions that sought to help them. Monks and nuns found themselves stretched thin, torn between their vows of charity and the practical realities of keeping their communities afloat. Tensions simmered and sometimes boiled over as the haves and have-nots jostled for position within the cloistered walls. For the homeless who managed to secure a foothold in these religious orders, life was far from easy. They were expected to work long hours in the fields and workshops, toiling alongside their more well-heeled brethren to keep the monastery running smoothly. They were held to the same strict standards of piety and obedience, their every move scrutinized for signs of backsliding or moral turpitude. And yet, for many, it was a price worth paying for the simple assurances of a roof over their head, a meal in their belly, and a modicum of human dignity. In the structured rhythms of monastic life, they found a measure of purpose and predictability that had eluded them in the chaos of the streets. Of course, not all religious orders were equally welcoming to the homeless and destitute. Some viewed them as little more than a drain on their resources, a distraction from their higher calling. In these communities, the poor were treated as second-class citizens, subjected to harsh discipline and menial labor, while being denied the full rights and privileges of the order. One poignant example comes from the records of a Benedictine abbey in the 14th century England. The abbey's chronicles speak of a homeless woman named Agnes, who sought refuge within its walls during a particularly brutal winter. Despite her obvious need, the abbot was reluctant to admit her, seeing her as little more than a burden on the community's already strained resources. Only after much pleading and prostration did he relent, allowing Agnes to take the veil as a lay sister. But her new life was far from an idyllic respite. She was relegated to the abbey's scullery, forced to toil long hours, scrubbing pots and hauling water for her more privileged sisters. Despite the backbreaking labor and constant indignities, Agnes persevered, finding small moments of grace in the simple rhythms of monastic life. In the quiet of the chapel, she could lose herself in the soaring harmonies of the choir, her spirit transported beyond the drudgery of her earthly existence. And in the fleeting camaraderie of her fellow lay sisters, she found a sense of kinship and belonging that had always eluded her on the streets. Together, they shared stories of their former lives, their hopes and dreams, their fears and sorrows. In the flickering light of a candle, they could almost forget the cruel realities that had brought them to this place. For Agnes and countless others like her, the monastery represented a fragile lifeline in a world that had little use for the poor and dispossessed. It was a tenuous existence, to be sure, always at the mercy of the whims and prejudices of their more privileged brethren. But it was a life, nonetheless, a chance to carve out some small measure of dignity and meaning in a world that had long since written them off. As we reflect on the plight of the homeless in the Middle Ages, it is easy to see echoes of their struggles in our own time. The same forces of poverty, displacement, and social stigma that drove so many to the margins of medieval society are still very much with us today. In the huddled forms sleeping rough on our city streets, in the gaunt faces lining up at our soup kitchens and shelters, we can see the same desperation and resilience that animated the lives of the medieval poor. Their stories may be separated by centuries, but the underlying human struggles remain the same. Perhaps, in studying the past, we can find some measure of wisdom and compassion to guide us in the present. By understanding the complex web of social, economic, and cultural factors that gave rise to homelessness in the Middle Ages, we can begin to untangle the knotty problems of our own era. And in the quiet acts of charity and solidarity that punctuated even the darkest chapters of medieval history, we can find glimmers of hope for our own troubled times. In the simple act of breaking bread with a homeless neighbour, of offering a kind word or a helping hand, we can begin to bridge the yawning chasms of class and circumstance that divide us. For in the end, the story of homelessness in the Middle Ages is not just a chronicle of suffering and despair. It is also a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit, to the stubborn resilience that allows us to find moments of grace and beauty even in the darkest of circumstances. As we close this chapter on the homeless of the medieval world, let us carry their stories with us as a reminder of our shared humanity. Let us honor their struggles and their triumphs, their sorrows and their joys. And let us work to build a world where no one is left to fend for themselves on the unforgiving streets. For in the end, their story is our story, a reminder of the fragile threads that bind us all together in this great tapestry of life. May we have the courage and the compassion to weave a brighter, more inclusive chapter for all who come after us. And so, we bid farewell to the homeless of the Middle Ages, secure in the knowledge that their legacy lives on in the hearts and minds of all who strive for a more just and humane world. May their memory be a blessing and a call to action, a reminder of the work that still lies ahead. As we drift off to sleep, let us hold their stories close, a talisman against the dark. And may we wake in the morning with renewed resolve to build a world where no one is left behind, where every human life is cherished and valued as a precious gift. So rest now, dear listener, and dream of a brighter tomorrow. The journey is long and the road is hard, but together we can make a difference. Together we can build a world where every person has a place to call home, a world where the story of the medieval homeless is a distant memory, a cautionary tale of a less enlightened age. Good night and sweet dreams. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the muddy streets, the town of 𝐼𝐴𝐿𝐼𝐿 settled in for another cold night. Flickering torches illuminated the hunched figures of peasants hurrying home, eager to shut out the darkness and the dangers that lurked within. For most, home meant a drafty thatched hut, warmed by a smoky hearth and the bodies of family and livestock pressed close. But for a wretched few, there was no such refuge from the night's icy grip. Huddled in a doorway, a ragged man drew his thin cloak tighter, trying to conserve the scant heat left in his emaciated frame. This was Thomas, a landless labourer who scratched out a meagre living from odd jobs and the occasional scrap of charity. A lifetime of toil had left him stooped and gnarled, but it was the gnawing emptiness in his belly that pained him most tonight. Thomas was no stranger to hunger, having survived many lean winters on little more than turnips and barley gruel. But this year was different. The rains had come late, drowning the crops and turning fields to mud. With food stores dwindling, prices soared beyond the reach of common folk. Now, even the rats were growing thin. Closing his rheumy eyes, Thomas let his mind drift to better times, before his wife succumbed to the flux and his son marched off to war, never to return. He thought of the little croft they once called home, with its sturdy walls and neatly thatched roof. It wasn't much, but it kept the wind and rain at bay. The hearth always had a pot bubbling, and his children's laughter rang out across the fields as they played. But those days were gone, swept away like leaves before an autumn gale. First the sickness took his love, then the Lord took his land, declaring it forfeit when he failed to meet the harvest tithe. Thomas found himself cast out, a stranger in his own village, reduced to begging for scraps and sleeping in hedges. It was a fate he shared with a growing multitude. For times were hard across the land. The 100 Years' War raged on and on, bleeding the countryside dry as armies marched back and forth, seizing food and burning what they could not carry. Young men were pressed into service, their bones scattered across foreign fields, while their families sank into ruin. Famine stalked the land, a grim spectre that left hollow cheeks and empty cradles in its wake. With so many driven to the brink, the roads swarmed with desperate folk, displaced peasants, crippled soldiers, and orphaned children. They clogged the cities, camping in squalid hovels outside the walls, and overwhelming the meagre charities of the church. In some places, it was said the homeless outnumbered those with roofs over their heads. It was a crisis beyond any in living memory, one that left no corner of society untouched. Yet, for all the suffering of the masses, those in power seemed blind to their plight. Lords and bishops still feasted in their halls, served by retinues of liveried servants, while the destitute huddled at their gates, hoping for a crust. As Thomas burrowed deeper into his cloak, stomach growling like a caged beast, he pondered this cruel contrast. How could a land of such plenty, graced by God's abundance, leave so many to waste away in squalor and despair? Were not all men children of the Almighty, owed a portion of his bounty? Such questions haunted Thomas as he drifted into a fitful sleep, one eye open against cutpurses and rogues. They were riddles beyond the ken of a simple man, the province of learned scholars who passed the mysteries of heaven and earth. All Thomas knew was the ache in his bones and the hole in his heart, the gnawing sense that the world had gone askew. As the first pale fingers of dawn crept across the sky, Thomas roused himself from his cramped shelter. His joints creaked in protest as he unfolded his long limbs, breath puffing in the frigid air. Stomping circulation back into his numb feet, he cast his gaze towards the town's square, where the market stalls were beginning to bustle with activity. Perhaps today would bring a chance for odd work, an errand to run or a load to haul in exchange for a hunk of bread or a swig of ale. It was a slender hope, but one that had sustained him through many a bleak morning. With a muttered prayer on his cracked lips, Thomas set off into the growing crowds, just one more anonymous figure amid a sea of need. As he navigated the muddy lanes, Thomas passed scenes that had grown all too familiar. Ragged children huddled around guttering cook fires, wizened crones hawking scavenged wares, crippled beggars pleading for alms with outstretched bowls. They were the flotsam of a kingdom in turmoil, cast adrift by the tides of war and want. Among these sorry spectres, a few stood out, their stories whispered from beggar to beggar like treasured heirlooms. There was Mad Martha, who lost her wits when her family perished of the pox, and now wandered the streets, babbling prophecies of doom. Or One-Eyed Jack, a veteran of Crécy, who traded tales of chivalry and gore for a place by the hearth. But the one who haunted Thomas most was Agnes, a comely lass not yet 20, driven to selling her favours for a crust of bread. He remembered her from before, a merry slip of a girl, always quick with a smile and a song. To see her now, hollow-cheeked and haunted, was like a dagger to the heart. As Thomas shuffled past the market stalls, his nose twitching at the enticing scents of fresh bread and roasting meat, he heard a commotion up ahead. Rising on his toes, he glimpsed a knot of people clustered around the pillory, where some poor sod was getting a rotten pelting. With a guilty start, Thomas recognized the slumped figure as Will, a simple-minded vagrant who often begged on the church steps. His crime, no doubt, was the usual one: vagrancy, that catch-all charge that saw the poor clapped in irons for the sin of existing. In a world where the wealthy jealously guarded their privilege, the sight of the needy was an affront, a blight to be swept from the streets, and so the homeless were harried from town to town, whipped and branded like stray dogs. Thomas watched the jeering crowd with a mix of pity and anger, remembering his own stints in the stocks. The humiliation of it still burned. The memory of gobs of filth spattering his face while his belly twisted with hunger. It was a cruelty beyond bearing, a reminder of how far he had fallen. With an effort, Thomas tore his gaze away and pressed on, his steps leaden with despair. What hope was there in a world that treated its weakest so? Where was the charity, the Christian mercy, that the priests droned on about in their sermons? It seemed to Thomas that the true face of the church was not the gentle smile of the Virgin, but the hard sneer of the tithe collector. As the sun climbed higher, burning away the morning mist, Thomas found himself at the edge of town, where the neat rows of thatch gave way to a squalid shanty town of lean-tos and hovels. This was the fringe, the no-man's land, where the homeless clustered like rats, scraping by on the leavings of their betters. The stench hit him like a fist, a miasma of unwashed bodies, human waste and despair. Thin trails of smoke curled from rickety chimneys, the scent of burning rubbish mingling with the sour reek of boiled cabbage. Scrawny dogs slunk between the shacks, ribs poking through mangy coats as they nosed for scraps. This was a place Thomas knew well, having sheltered here through many a bitter night. There was a grim camaraderie among the residents, a sense that they were all in the same leaky boat. They pooled what meagre resources they had, sharing scanty meals and huddling together for warmth. But even here, on the margins of society, there was no true escape from the cruel calculus of survival. Fights erupted over mouldy crusts and cast-off rags, desperate souls driven to extremes by gnawing want, and always the spectre of disease hung over the camp like a pall, picking off the weakest with merciless efficiency. Thomas had seen it all, the bloody flux that left its victims shitting out their guts, the putrid fever that made the skin slough off in sheets. He had watched friends and strangers alike wither away, their last breaths rattling in sunken chests. It was a pitiless end, one he prayed nightly to be spared. As he picked his way through the muddy lanes, nodding to familiar faces etched with hardship, Thomas felt a heaviness settle on his shoulders. Another day of scrabbling and scrimping stretched before him. Another day of fighting the hunger that clawed at his belly like a living thing. But what choice did he have? This was the lot of the landless poor, the grim reality behind the minstrel's tales of courtly love and daring do. While lords and ladies played at chivalry, the likes of Thomas scrabbled in the dirt, praying for a scrap of their leavings. It was a bitter draught to swallow, but one that Thomas had long since grown accustomed to. You learned to take your joys where you could. A kind word from a stranger, a bit of salted pork stretched over a week. You clung to those moments of grace like a drowning man to driftwood, praying they would be enough to see you through. And so, as the sun reached its zenith, Thomas set about his daily ritual of survival, begging a crust here, hauling a load there, always with one eye on the horizon for trouble. It was a precarious dance, one where a single misstep could mean the difference between a full belly and an empty grave. But dance it he would, for as long as his weary legs could carry him. Because in a world where kings and bishops turned blind eyes to the suffering of their flock, where the very earth seemed to groan under the weight of so much misery, what else could a man do but endure? This was the lot of the homeless in medieval times, a tale of grim survival against impossible odds. It was a story seldom told in the tapestries and chronicles of the age, lost in the shadow of shining deeds and courtly intrigues. But for those like Thomas, for the countless souls huddled in doorways and hovels, it was a story etched in blood and hunger, in the ache of empty bellies and the chill of winter nights. It was a story of the forgotten, the dispossessed, the ones left to rot in the margins of a world that had no place for them. And yet, even in the depths of their despair, they endured. They clung to life with a stubborn tenacity, a refusal to let the darkness claim them. In their ragged bands and squalid camps, they found a grim sort of fellowship, a sense that they were not alone in their suffering. It was a bond forged in shared hardship, a kinship of the forgotten. And though it might not fill their bellies or mend their rags, it gave them something to cling to, a flicker of light in the gathering gloom. For in the end, what else did they have but each other? In a world that had cast them aside, left them to scrabble in the muck like beasts, they found a strange sort of solace in their shared misery. It was a cold comfort, to be sure, but one that saw them through many a bleak night. And so they endured, these lost souls of the Middle Ages. They endured through famine and plague, through the indifference of the mighty and the scorn of the comfortable. They endured because they had no choice, because to give in to despair was to let the darkness win. Their names might be lost to history, their struggles forgotten in the mists of time, but in their endurance, in their stubborn refusal to let the world break them, they left a legacy all their own, a testament to the indomitable spirit of the human soul, to the unquenchable spark that burns within us all. It is a legacy that echoes down through the ages, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, hope endures. For as long as there are those who suffer, who cry out for justice in a world that seems deaf to their pleas, the spirit of the forgotten will never truly die. And so we remember them, these lost souls of the Middle Ages. We remember their struggles, their sorrows, their small triumphs snatched from the jaws of despair. We remember them not as statistics or footnotes, but as flesh and blood, as brothers and sisters in the great human family. In doing so, we honor their memory and the memories of all those who have been left behind by the march of history. We hold a light to the darkness, a candle against the encroaching gloom. For in the end, is that not the true measure of our humanity? Not in the shining deeds of kings and conquerors, but in the quiet courage of the forgotten, the ones who endure against all odds. It is a question worth pondering as we go about our own struggles, our own daily battles against the darkness. For in the end, are we not all wanderers in this vale of tears, all searching for a place to lay our weary heads? Perhaps, in remembering the homeless of medieval times, in holding their stories close to our hearts, we can find a measure of that solidarity, that sense of shared struggle that sees us through the bleakest of nights. For in the end, we are all pilgrims on this earthly road, all seeking a glimpse of light in the darkness, and in the stories of the forgotten, in the quiet courage of the dispossessed, we may just find a flicker of that eternal flame, guiding us home at last. As the sun began to sink once more, painting the sky in shades of fire and gold, Thomas made his weary way back to his accustomed spot in the town square. His legs ached from the day's labours, his belly still grumbling its discontent, but there was a lightness in his step that had not been there before. Perhaps it was the memory of a kind word from the baker's wife, slipping him a fresh roll with a conspiratorial wink, or the sight of two urchins, rags flapping, laughing as they chased each other through the muddy streets. Small moments of grace, snatched from the teeth of a world that so often seemed to offer nothing but sorrow. As he settled into his nook, back braced against rough stone, Thomas let his eyes drift shut. Let the sounds of the town wash over him in a comforting tide. The creak of a cartwheel, the distant bleat of a goat, the low murmur of voices rising and falling in the evening air. It was a symphony he knew by heart, the music of a world that, for all its cruelties, still held pockets of warmth, of light. And as he drifted off to sleep, lulled by that familiar refrain, Thomas felt a small smile tug at the corners of his mouth. For in that moment, he was not a beggar, not a vagrant, but simply a man, a child of God like any other. And in that shared humanity, that flicker of the divine that burned within them all, he found a strange sort of peace, a balm for the aches of the soul. It was a peace, hard won, forged in the crucible of suffering and want, but it was his, a treasure no one could take from him. And as he slipped into dreams, wrapped in the tattered cloak of his own endurance, Thomas knew that, come what may, he would rise to greet another dawn. For such was the way of the forgotten, the dispossessed, the ones who clung to life with a stubborn grace. They endured through the long nights and the lean years, through the indifference of the world and the cruelty of fate. They endured because they had to, because to do otherwise was to let the darkness win. And in that endurance, that quiet defiance of a world that would see them broken, they found a strength beyond measure, a light that no shadow could dim. It is a light that still shines today in the hearts of all those who struggle, who toil in the face of impossible odds. It is the light of hope, of resilience, of the unquenchable human spirit. And as we remember the homeless of medieval times, as we hold their stories close and draw strength from their courage, we keep that light burning, a beacon for all those who wander in the dark. For in the end, we are all pilgrims on this earthly road, all seeking a way through the wilderness of our days. And in the footsteps of the forgotten, in the echoes of their quiet triumph, we may just find the path that leads us home. So let us remember them, these lost souls of history. Let us hold their memory close, a talisman against the gathering dark. And in doing so, let us find the courage to endure, to hope, to love in the face of all that would see us broken. For in the end, that is the true legacy of the forgotten. Not a tale of sorrow, but a testament to the human spirit, As we've seen, the plight of the homeless in medieval Europe was a grim and unforgiving existence. Forced to eke out a meager living on the fringes of society, they faced constant struggles for the basic necessities of shelter, food, and safety. But perhaps most cruel of all was the social stigma and persecution they endured from a society that viewed them with scorn and suspicion. In the eyes of medieval society, to be homeless was to be an outcast, a pariah, a blight on the community. Homelessness was seen not as a misfortune or a failure of the system, but as a moral failing, a sign of laziness, vice, or criminality. The prevailing belief was that anyone who found themselves without a home must have done something to deserve it, whether it be sin, sloth, or some other personal defect. This harsh judgment was reflected in the language used to describe the homeless. They were called vagrants, vagabonds, beggars, and worse, all terms that carried connotations of worthlessness and depravity. In legal statutes and official proclamations, they were often lumped together with other undesirables like lepers, prostitutes, and thieves. To be homeless was to be tainted, corrupted, a stain on the social fabric that needed to be cleansed. This stigma manifested in the way the homeless were treated by their fellow man. In towns and cities, they were often subjected to abuse, mockery, and physical violence. Passers-by would spit on them, hurl insults, or even pelt them with rotten food and refuse. Children would sometimes make a game of tormenting the homeless, poking them with sticks, or setting their meager possessions on fire. For the amusement of onlookers, some towns even held grotesque spectacles where homeless people were put in stocks and subjected to public humiliation and abuse. One particularly poignant example of this cruelty comes from the records of a small English town in the 14th century. A homeless man named John Howson was caught begging on the streets and brought before the local magistrate. As punishment for his vagrancy, Howson was sentenced to a day in the stocks, where he was to be pelted with rotten produce by the good citizens of the town. For hours, Howson endured a relentless barrage of putrid fruits and vegetables hurled by jeering townspeople. Rotten tomatoes splattered across his face, mixing with the tears that streamed down his cheeks. Overripe cabbages and turnips rained down on his head, leaving him bruised and battered. By the end of the day, Howson was a broken man, his spirit crushed by the gleeful cruelty of his tormentors. But the stocks were just one form of persecution the homeless faced. In many towns, local authorities would regularly round up vagrants and forcibly expel them from the area. These homeless people, who had often lived their whole lives in the town, were given no support or resources, simply driven out and told never to return under pain of imprisonment or worse. For a 14th century homeless woman named Agnes Thatcher, this banishment was a death sentence. After being driven out of her village for vagrancy, Agnes, who was elderly and frail, had nowhere to go. With no food, shelter, or aid from the village that had been her home, she wandered the countryside for days before collapsing from hunger and exposure. Her body was found by travellers and given a pauper's burial, unmourned and forgotten by the society that had cast her out. Stories like those of John Howson and Agnes Thatcher paint a chilling picture of the casual cruelty and lack of empathy with which medieval society treated its homeless population. To be homeless in this era was to be less than human, unworthy of compassion or kindness. It was a harsh judgment that left countless souls to suffer and perish in misery. But even in the face of such relentless persecution, there were some who sought to ease the burden of the homeless, however slightly. Amidst the cruelty of the age, there were rare glimmers of charity and humanity to be found. And for some lucky few, these acts of kindness offered a thin ray of hope in the darkness. Perhaps the most significant source of aid for the medieval homeless came from religious institutions. Monasteries, convents, and other religious orders were known to take in destitute and desperate souls, offering them food, shelter, and a chance at a new life in service to God. For those homeless people who were willing and able to adopt the strict lifestyle of religious orders, these institutions could be a saving grace, a refuge from the hardships and dangers of life on the streets. Within the walls of a monastery or convent, they would be given simple food and humble lodgings, as well as a sense of structure, purpose, and community. Of course, life in a religious order was not without its hardships and sacrifices. Those who joined were expected to abide by a strict code of conduct, following the rules and routines of monastic life to the letter. They would be required to perform daily duties and chores, attend regular prayer services and religious rites, and forsake all worldly possessions and attachments. For a homeless person named Margaret, this regimented lifestyle was a welcome change from the chaos and uncertainty of life on the streets. Margaret had lost her home and family to the Black Death and had been forced to beg and scavenge for scraps just to survive. When she stumbled upon a small convent in the countryside, starving and sick, the nuns there took her in and nursed her back to health. As she regained her strength, Margaret found herself drawn to the simple, devout life of the nuns. She began to attend their daily prayers and assist with their chores, finding solace in the rhythms of religious life. Eventually, she made the decision to join the convent as a novice, taking vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. For Margaret, the convent became her home and the nuns her family. She found purpose and fulfillment in serving God and her fellow sisters, and was grateful for the food, shelter, and sense of belonging the religious life provided. It was a hard life, to be sure, but for a homeless woman like Margaret, it was a vast improvement over the misery and danger of the streets. But even the charity of religious orders had its limits, and not all who sought refuge there were welcomed with open arms. Many monasteries and convents, already struggling to feed and house their own members, simply did not have the resources to take in every desperate soul who came to their door. Some were forced to turn away the homeless and destitute, leaving them to fend for themselves in a hostile world. Moreover, even those homeless people who were taken in by religious orders often found themselves treated more as burdens than as equals. They were given the most menial tasks and the least comfortable accommodations, and were often subjected to harsh discipline and strict oversight. For some, the regimented life of the monastery or convent proved too restrictive, too stifling, and they chose to return to the streets, preferring the hardships of homelessness to the rigid constraints of religious life. But despite these limitations, the fact remains that for many of Europe's homeless religious institutions offered a rare glimmer of hope and humanity in an otherwise uncaring world. In a society that viewed them as outcasts and pariahs, unworthy of compassion or dignity, these orders provided a small measure of refuge and respite from the cruelties of medieval life. It was not a perfect solution, nor a complete one. The charity of religious orders could only do so much to alleviate the immense suffering of Europe's homeless population. But for those lucky few who found their way to the shelter of a monastery or convent, it could mean the difference between life and death, between misery and a chance at a new beginning. As we come to the end of our journey through the harrowing world of medieval homelessness, it's hard not to feel a sense of sorrow and despair at the immense suffering and injustice we've witnessed. The homeless of this era were truly the outcasts of their society, reviled and persecuted simply for the crime of being poor and destitute. But in the midst of this darkness, there were also glimmers of light, the small acts of kindness and charity that revealed the better angels of human nature. From the nuns who took in the sick and starving, to the beggars who shared their meagre scraps with their fellow sufferers. These moments of compassion remind us that even in the bleakest of times, the human spirit is capable of great generosity and empathy. And as we reflect on the lessons of this tragic history, it's hard not to see echoes of the medieval world in our own society's treatment of the homeless. Even today, in an age of unprecedented wealth and prosperity, we still too often view the homeless as outcasts and pariahs, unworthy of our compassion or concern. But the story of medieval homelessness reminds us that this harsh judgment is not only cruel, but short-sighted. For in the end, a society is only as strong as its most vulnerable members, and a world that turns its back on the poor and destitute is a world that diminishes us all. Perhaps then, the true lesson of this history is not one of despair, but of empathy and understanding. By looking back at the suffering of the medieval homeless, we are reminded of our common humanity, of the fundamental dignity and worth of every person, no matter their station in life. And in that reminder, we may find the inspiration to build a better world. A world where no one is left to suffer in the gutters and alleyways, where every person is treated with the compassion and respect they deserve. It is a lofty goal, to be sure, but one that is worthy of our highest aspirations. As we close our eyes and drift off to sleep, let us hold that vision in our hearts. A vision of a world where the homeless are not outcasts, but valued members of our shared human family. And let us dream of a future where the cruel lessons of medieval homelessness are not forgotten, but rather serve as a reminder of the work we still have left to do. The Black Death was absolutely devastating to medieval Europe's homeless population. This merciless plague spared no one, but it hit society's most vulnerable and destitute the hardest. Imagine the terror that must have gripped a homeless encampment as this mysterious disease started claiming lives. Picture a makeshift village of hovels and lean-tos, cobbled together from old timbers and cast-off rags on the muddy outskirts of a town. The inhabitants here already lived a precarious hand-to-mouth existence. But then, an even grimmer spectre than poverty darkened their doors: the plague. It likely started innocently enough. Perhaps a homeless woman nursing a sick child, or a beggar returning to camp with a hacking cough after a day pleading for alms in the town market. But this was no ordinary fever or illness. This was the Black Death in all its grotesque savagery. The first victims would develop agonizing swellings the size of eggs or apples in their armpits, neck, and groin. These buboes, as they were called, would ooze pus and blood. Dark blotches would mottle their skin as the flesh died and turned black, a telltale sign that gave this plague its chilling moniker. Fevers raged as the afflicted moaned in delirious agony. Some vomited or coughed up blood as the sickness ravaged their internal organs. The stench of impending death mingled with the reek of filth and decay that already hung over the camp. It was a tableau of pure horror. As more of the homeless villagers succumbed, panic began to set in. Some tried to flee, staggering away in a futile attempt to outrun the pestilence. They only succeeded in spreading it further. Others turned to desperate prayers and superstitions, lucky charms, self-flagellation, anything to ward off the scourge. But the Black Death could not be bargained with or appeased. It scythed through the camp without pity. Entire families were wiped out shivering in their huts. The rapidly mounting dead lay where they fell, with no one left to bury them. A carpet of bloated corpses attracted swarms of flies and rats, which only hastened the spread. By the time the plague burned itself out, few, if any, of these homeless wretches remained alive. It was total devastation, a bleak portrait of the Black Death's all-consuming maw. Medieval chroniclers wrote of towns where the poor died as thick as cattle in a field. As horrendous as the suffering was in the general population, it was magnitudes worse for the homeless who already teetered on the razor's edge of oblivion. They lacked even the meager comforts or resources that a peasant family might scrape together. For medieval society's unwanted castaways, the Black Death was an apocalyptic nightmare from which many never awoke. It was a grim reminder of the abyss that always yawned just inches beneath their feet. Even in better times, a homeless person lived shadowed by the spectre of death, from exposure, starvation, or violence. The plague simply made manifest the brutal precarity of their existence. Of course, those homeless who somehow survived the initial onslaught of pestilence found little respite. If anything, their plight worsened as the Black Death decimated the population and unraveled the social fabric. With labour suddenly scarce, aristocrats ruthlessly cracked down on beggars and vagrants, seeing them as indolent wastrels shirking their duties. The English Parliament passed the Statute of Labourers in 1351, which essentially criminalised unemployment. Anyone able-bodied who wasn't toiling for a lord could be branded a vagrant and subjected to brutal punishments like whipping, the stocks, or prison. Destitute survivors of the plague discovered that where the disease had not killed them, the law now tried to. In the wake of the plague, a streak of moral panic gripped Europe. Grieving, frightened, and angry people looked for someone to blame. Sadly but predictably, society's most vulnerable and marginalized made for easy targets and scapegoats. Some priests and preachers proclaimed the plague was God's wrath against sin, particularly the sin of greed. In their sermons, they railed against the wealthy for their avarice and luxuries, but they also scolded the poor for their envy and covetousness of others' prosperity. The not-so-subtle message was that the homeless had brought this suffering upon themselves through their own moral failings. Other rabble-rousers spun wild conspiracy theories that the plague was actually the evil work of heretics, witches, or Jews scheming to destroy Christendom. Frighteningly, people slaughtered members of these groups in misguided attempts to halt the pestilence. Once again, the homeless made for easy marks. Their ragged appearance and social isolation left them vulnerable to accusations of witchcraft or heresy. For the homeless, the Black Death was a cataclysm that decimated their ranks and then twisted the knife in the wound. It subjected the few shell-shocked survivors to even greater persecution and suffering in the plague's bleak aftermath. Their dire fate stands as a somber monument to the Black Death's power to reap not just lives, but hope and dignity as well. Sadly, the plight of homeless plague victims has faded into the footnotes of history. We will never know most of their names or stories. In their own time, few mourned or marked their passing. No memorials commemorate their suffering. But in many ways, their experience captures the starkest essence of the medieval homeless ordeal: to be snuffed out by an uncaring world and vanish without a trace. The grim saga of homelessness in the Middle Ages takes on an even bleaker pallor against the inky backdrop of the Black Death. This was a time drenched in death, when mortality was the looming abyss at the edge of every step, and no one teetered closer to that precipice than the homeless, forever pushed to the margins in life, and the first to be erased in death. In the wake of such an apocalyptic calamity, one might expect people to unite in compassion and mutual aid. But for medieval Europe's homeless, the plague only seemed to sharpen the knives of hostility and accusation leveled against them. Cries of contagion and calls for quarantine took on an even uglier timbre when directed at the unwashed masses. Despite the doomsday feel of the era, life did go on after the plague, albeit in a permanently altered form. Societies slowly knit themselves back together and commenced the long, painful process of healing and rebuilding. But this offered cold comfort to the homeless, who found themselves more isolated and despised than ever. The Black Death was, in many ways, the ultimate trial for a population already pushed to the brink of endurance. It laid bare, in the most visceral way, the sheer precarity and disposability of homeless lives in medieval times. The plague spared no one, but it reserved its cruelest ravages for those who already clung to the bottom rungs of society. Even among a benighted peasantry, the homeless stood out as icons of abjection, reviled as reservoirs of pestilence and symbols of moral decay. The Black Death burned away any pretense to the contrary, reducing homeless bodies to just more detritus to be carted off and burned in the plague pits. In the final accounting, the Black Death served as an almost biblically scaled rebuke to the idea that there was any deeper meaning or redemption to be found in the sufferings of the destitute. It mocked the notion that poverty could ennoble the soul or bring one closer to God. The plague's indiscriminate scythe laid waste to both wicked and virtuous, revealing the ultimate futility of attempting to square the medieval moral economy. For the homeless especially, the Black Death was simply a bottomless horror, from which no transcendent lessons or higher purpose could be wrung. It was squalor and suffering distilled to its starkest essence, a reminder of the cold, brute savagery churning just beneath the surface of the medieval world's pious veneer. As we gaze back across the gulf of centuries, we might be tempted to console ourselves that such horrors are firmly quarantined to the past. A relic of more barbarous times when superstition reigned and people were powerless in the face of nature's cruelty. But are they really? To this day, the homeless still find themselves shunned as carriers of contagion, whether literal or social. They are still herded into camps and ghettos, out of sight and out of mind. They are still the first to be sacrificed and the last to be mourned in times of crisis. The language may have changed, but the cruel melody of stigma and dehumanization remains hauntingly familiar. Perhaps this is the deepest cut left by our medieval forebears, not the gory particulars of the plague itself, but the disquieting insights it offers into the human capacity for callousness toward our most vulnerable neighbors. Insights that still echo with eerie resonance down through the ages. In the final reckoning, there may be no tidy moral to wrap up the grim saga of homelessness in the Middle Ages. No soothing homilies or heartening parables to soften history's harsh contours. Only a procession of human anguish that forces us to grapple with some of our species' most uncomfortable truths. And yet, even in this darkest chapter, there are still glimmers of resilience and solidarity, of bonds of compassion that couldn't be broken by the most crushing adversity. Homeless victims of the plague often cared for one another when no one else would, demonstrating a dogged commitment to preserving human dignity in the face of ultimate degradation. So perhaps the deepest legacy left to us by the Black Death's homeless victims is the charge to take up that flickering torch of empathy and carry it forward. To see in their struggles reflections of our own precarity and promise. To recognize that a society is only as healthy as those it relegates to the margins. It is a grim inheritance, to be sure, but one that can spur us to craft a different sort of future. A world where plagues may still strike, but compassion never withers. These forgotten souls have borne mute witness to history's darkest chapters. We owe it to their memory to build something brighter from the ashes of all they endured. As we close this sobering chapter on the intersection of homelessness and plague in the Middle Ages, we are left with more shadows than light. The spectre of the Black Death serves as perhaps the starkest reminder of just how precarious and expendable homeless lives were in this unforgiving era. But in those shadows, we can still discern the faint outlines of our shared humanity. the stubborn flickers of kindness and kinship that even the plague could not fully extinguish. It is a testament to the indomitable human spirit that even in the darkest times, there were still those who fought to preserve a shred of dignity and hope. Ultimately, the tragic saga of medieval homelessness is not just a static tableau of suffering frozen in the distant past. It is a mirror that reflects back to us perennial questions about the kind of society we want to be, about what and who we value. The homeless of the Middle Ages may have been consigned to the margins of history, but their struggles still speak to us across the centuries. They whisper of the perils of allowing fear and prejudice to eclipse our common humanity, of the cost of callousness and the toll of indifference. In the face of such bleak vistas, it is tempting to despair, to throw up our hands at the sheer intractability of human cruelty and the apparent inevitability of history's brutalities. But to do so would be to compound the tragedy and to dishonor the memory of those who fought against all odds to hold on to their humanity. Instead, let us take from this dark chapter a renewed commitment to compassion and justice, to seeing in the struggles of the marginalized echoes of our own vulnerability and common yearnings. The Black Death laid bare the fault lines of medieval society in the most visceral way possible. It is up to us to heed its grim lessons and work to build a world where such suffering is not just mourned, but prevented. This is the charge that the homeless victims of the plague leave to us across the ages, to pick up the torch of empathy they kept alive in the darkest of times and carry it forward. To recognize that a society's true measure lies in how it treats those with the least. To remember that in the face of even the most unfathomable adversity, our capacity for compassion is the one thing we can never let wither. As we close the book on this harrowing chapter of history, let us do so not with a sense of helplessness, but with a renewed sense of purpose. The story of medieval homelessness is not just a tragedy to be lamented, but a call to action to be heeded. A reminder that the arc of history may be long, but it bends towards justice only if we have the courage and compassion to bend it ourselves. So let us take up that challenge, even as we take a moment to honor the suffering and resilience of those who came before. In their struggles, we see reflections of our own. In their persistence, we find inspiration for our own. The homeless of the Middle Ages may be gone, but their legacy endures, a testament to the indomitable human spirit and a summons to build a world worthy of it. And with that poignant charge, we draw our exploration of homelessness in medieval Europe to a close. The annals of this era may be stained with blood and tears, but they are also shot through with glimmers of hope and humanity that no plague could fully extinguish. It is up to us to nurture those embers and fan them into a brighter flame. As we embark on that noble work, we carry with us the memory of those who walked this path before us. The homeless, the hungry, the shunned, and the persecuted. Theirs is a story of almost unfathomable hardship, but also of incredible resilience. A reminder that even in the face of the most daunting odds, the human spirit endures. So let us hold that spirit close as we navigate our own uncertain times. Let us draw strength from the knowledge that others have walked darker roads before us and emerged unbowed. And let us recommit ourselves to building a world where no one is left to weather life's storms alone, unhoused and unmourned. This is the work of generations, to be sure, but it is work that we must take up with urgency and conviction. For in the end, the measure of our progress will not be in the grandeur of our monuments or the abundance of our coffers, but in the dignity and decency we accord to the least among us. That is the legacy left to us by the homeless of the Middle Ages, a call to see in their struggles our own common humanity and to let that recognition spur us to action, to build a world where compassion knows no bounds and where every person can lay claim to a place of warmth, safety, and belonging. It is a lofty vision, to be sure, but one that we must never stop reaching for. For in the end, the story of medieval homelessness is not just a chapter in a dusty history book, but a living testament to the enduring power of the human spirit and a summons to let that spirit guide us forward. And so, as we close this exploration of a distant but all too resonant past, let us do so with heavy hearts, but also with uplifted spirits. Let us mourn the suffering of those who came before, but let us also draw inspiration from their incredible resilience. And let us recommit ourselves to the hard but necessary work of building a world where such suffering is consigned to the history books once and for all. It is a charge that echoes down to us from the distant clamour of the Middle Ages, a reminder that the arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice only if we have the courage and compassion to bend it ourselves. So let us take up that charge with humility, with conviction, and with an unwavering commitment to honouring the humanity in all our neighbours, housed and unhoused alike. For in the end, that is the only tribute that truly matters. Not grand words or empty gestures, but a society that embodies the very best of the human spirit, and that ensures no one is left to walk life's road alone. It is a vision worth fighting for, and one that we must never stop working towards, in memory of those who came before, and in hope for all those yet to come. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the cobblestone streets, the town of Bury St Edmunds prepared to shutter its doors for the night. Shopkeepers locked up their wares, children were ushered inside, and the sense of humble suppers wafted from the chimneys. But for one woman, there was no warm hearth or comforting meal to look forward to. Matilda huddled in a narrow alley, her back pressed against the rough stone wall of the tanner's shop. The acrid stench of urine and rotting garbage assailed her nostrils, but she was too exhausted to care. Her stomach growled painfully, having gone yet another day with nothing but a few crusts of stale bread to sustain her. Matilda pulled her threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders, trying in vain to ward off the chilly night air. This had been her life for nearly a year now, ever since her husband succumbed to a festering wound he'd received in the fields. Without his income, meagre as it was, Matilda had been unable to pay the rent on their tiny cottage. The landlord, a cruel and avaricious man, had wasted no time in tossing her out onto the streets with nothing but the clothes on her back. At first, Matilda had sought help from her neighbours and the parish priest. But times were lean for everyone, and soon the doors began to close in her face. The priest, at least, would occasionally offer her a hunk of bread or a sip of ale, but it was never enough to fill the aching void in her belly. Desperation had driven Matilda to beg on the streets, holding out a trembling hand to passers-by in the hopes of receiving a coin or a scrap of food. But begging was a risky endeavour. The town authorities took a dim view of vagrants and beggars, seeing them as a blight on the social order. More than once, Matilda had been chased off by a constable brandishing a club and threatening to haul her away to the stocks. As the night wore on and the streets grew quiet, Matilda's mind drifted to happier times. She remembered the warmth of her husband's embrace, the laughter of her children who had not survived infancy, the simple pleasure of a full belly and a roof over her head. Tears streamed down her grimy cheeks as the weight of her misery bore down upon her. Matilda was just one of countless homeless souls adrift in the chaotic sea of medieval society. In an age where the feudal system held sway, the notion of a social safety net was practically non-existent. If a person fell on hard times due to illness, injury, or the loss of a breadwinner, they were largely left to fend for themselves. Estimates suggest that in the 14th century England, as much as half the population lived in poverty. For many, homelessness was a constant spectre lurking on the fringes of their lives. A run of bad luck, a failed harvest, or a prolonged illness could easily push a family over the brink into destitution. The the precariousness of medieval life meant that homelessness was a fluid and ever-shifting phenomenon. People might drift in and out of homelessness as their fortunes waxed and waned. A migrant labourer might find himself sleeping rough between harvest seasons, while a journeyman craftsman could be reduced to begging if he failed to find work in a new town. War, too, played a major role in swelling the ranks of the homeless. The 100 Years' War between England and France, which raged across the 14th and 15th centuries, left a trail of devastation in its wake. Marauding armies would often burn and pillage as they moved through the countryside, leaving entire villages destitute and homeless. The Black Death, the infamous plague that swept through Europe in the mid-14th century, also had a profound impact on homelessness. As the disease ravaged communities, wiping out entire families, it left behind a landscape of abandoned homes and orphaned children. Many of these unfortunate souls were forced to take to the roads, becoming itinerant beggars and vagabonds. For medieval people grappling with homelessness, life was a relentless trial. Without a roof over their heads, they were at the mercy of the elements, exposed to biting cold, driving rain, and sweltering heat. Makeshift shelters of sticks and straw offered little protection against the harshness of the seasons. One of the greatest challenges for homeless people was simply finding a place to lay their head at night. In larger towns and cities, they might seek out quiet corners in churchyards or graveyards, bedding down amidst the tombstones. Others would construct crude lean-tos against the walls of buildings, using whatever materials they could scavenge. But such improvised shelters were often far from safe havens. Homeless encampments were seen as dens of criminality and vice by medieval authorities, who would periodically order them to be cleared out and burned to the ground. The inhabitants would be left to flee with whatever meagre possessions they could carry, forced to start anew elsewhere. Even when homeless people were able to find a relatively secure place to sleep, their slumber was often anything but restful. The constant threat of violence, theft, and harassment meant that many slept with one eye open, ready to bolt at the first sign of trouble. The close quarters and unsanitary conditions of homeless encampments also created a perfect breeding ground for disease, which could spread like wildfire through the vulnerable population. Despite the many hardships they faced, medieval homeless people showed remarkable resilience and ingenuity in their quest for shelter. In the English town of Norwich, records from the 14th century describe a homeless community that constructed a makeshift village on the outskirts of town, using salvaged materials to build huts and shacks. The inhabitants of this ramshackle settlement, known as the Borough of Huts, pooled their resources and skills to create a semblance of a functioning community. Some worked as labourers or craftsmen in town during the day, while others foraged for food or tended small garden plots. At night, they would gather around communal fires to share meals and stories. But even this tenuous haven was not to last. As the town of Norwich grew and prospered, the land occupied by the Borough of Huts became increasingly valuable. In 1349, the town authorities ordered the settlement to be demolished, citing concerns about crime and public health. The inhabitants were once again cast adrift, left to fend for themselves in a hostile world. For Matilda and her fellow homeless people, the daily struggle for shelter was compounded by the constant gnawing of hunger. In an era where subsistence farming was the norm and food surpluses were rare, even those with a roof over their heads often teetered on the brink of starvation. For the homeless, the spectre of hunger was a constant companion. Begging was one of the few options available to homeless people seeking to fill their bellies. They would take up positions outside churches or on busy thoroughfares, holding out a hand or a bowl in supplication. Some would recite prayers or sing hymns in the hopes of eliciting sympathy and charity from passers-by. But begging was a risky and uncertain enterprise. Many towns had strict laws against vagrancy and loitering, and those caught begging could face harsh punishments. In the 14th century London, for example, Beggars were required to wear special badges and were only permitted to beg in designated areas. Those found begging without permission could be whipped, pilloried, or even banished from the city. Even when begging was tolerated, the pickings were often slim. In a world where most people lived hand to mouth, there was little surplus to be had. A beggar might consider themselves lucky to receive a few scraps of stale bread or a handful of vegetables at the end of a long day of pleading. For some homeless people, scavenging and foraging offered a meagre supplement to begging. They would comb through rubbish heaps and middens, searching for bits of edible refuse or items that could be sold or bartered. In the countryside, they might gather wild plants and berries or catch small game to stave off hunger. But such subsistence strategies were fraught with danger. Eating spoiled or contaminated food could lead to serious illness or even death, while foraging in the woods or fields left one vulnerable to attack by wild animals or hostile peasants. The perils of this hand-to-mouth existence can be seen in the tragic story of Agnes Purchild, a homeless woman who lived in the English town of Wells in the early 15th century. Court records from 1421 describe how Agnes, a vagabond and mendicant, was arrested for stealing a loaf of bread from a local baker. According to the records, Agnes had been begging in the town for several days, but had received little in the way of alms. Desperate and starving, she had slipped into the bakery and made off with the loaf, only to be caught by the baker's apprentice. Despite her pleas for mercy, the court showed little sympathy for her plight. Agnes was sentenced to a public whipping and banished from the town on pain of further punishment. For homeless people like Agnes, the threat of hunger was compounded by the ever-present danger of disease. In an era where medical knowledge was rudimentary at best, even minor ailments could quickly become life-threatening if left untreated. For those living in squalid and unsanitary conditions, the risk of illness was even greater. Homeless encampments were notorious breeding grounds for disease, with close quarters and poor hygiene allowing infections to spread like wildfire. Dysentery, typhoid fever, and other gastrointestinal illnesses were common, spread by contaminated food and water. Respiratory infections like tuberculosis also took a heavy toll, aided by the damp and drafty conditions in which many homeless people lived. Perhaps the most terrifying disease of all was the Black Death, the plague that ravaged Europe in the mid-14th century. The plague struck rich and poor alike, but it was particularly devastating for homeless populations. Without access to proper care or sanitation, they were easy prey for the disease. In the French town of Tournai, records from 1349 describe a great mortality among the homeless population during the height of the plague. The town's chronicler wrote of how the streets were littered with the bodies of the dead and dying, with no one to bury them or offer them comfort in their final moments. One of the most poignant stories to emerge from this dark time is that of a homeless man known only as John. According to the chronicler, John had once been a prosperous merchant, but had lost everything in a series of bad investments. Reduced to begging on the streets, he had been taken in by a group of fellow homeless people who sheltered in an abandoned church on the outskirts of town. When the plague struck, it swept through the makeshift community like a scythe, felling young and old alike. John, who was already weakened by hunger and exposure, succumbed quickly to the disease. In his final moments, he was tended to by a kind-hearted priest who had braved the danger to offer what comfort he could to the dying. As John breathed his last, the priest recorded his final words: "I have lived a life of misery and despair, but in death I have found the mercy of God." It was a poignant epitaph for a man whose life had been defined by hardship and suffering, but who had found a measure of peace in his final moments. For those homeless people who were lucky enough to survive disease and starvation, there was still the constant spectre of violence and persecution. In a society where the poor were often seen as a threat to the social order, homeless people were frequent targets of abuse and exploitation, town authorities would often round up vagrants and beggars and subject them to public humiliation and punishment. In some cases, they were put in the stocks or pillory, where they would be pelted with rotten fruit and vegetables by jeering crowds. In other cases, they were branded or mutilated as a warning to others. Even more horrific were the instances of mob violence against homeless people. In times of social unrest or economic hardship, homeless populations often became scapegoats for the frustrations and fears of the broader population. They were accused of spreading disease, committing crimes, or even practicing witchcraft. One particularly chilling example comes from the German town of Speyer in 1446. That year, a homeless man named Konrad Schmidt was accused of stealing a chalice from the local cathedral. Despite his protests of innocence, Schmidt was seized by an angry mob and dragged to the town square. There, he was subjected to a brutal and horrific punishment known as the barrel of shame. He was stripped naked and forced into a large barrel, which was then rolled through the streets as the crowd jeered and threw stones. The barrel was eventually brought to the banks of the Rhine River, where Schmidt was thrown in and left to drown. Schmidt's story is a tragic reminder of the cruelty and brutality that homeless people faced in medieval society. Without the protection of wealth or status, they were vulnerable to the whims and prejudices of those in power. Their very existence was seen as a threat to the social order, and they were treated as less than human as a result. For some homeless people, the only hope of escape from this cycle of poverty and persecution was to seek refuge in religious orders. Monasteries and convents were often seen as havens for the poor and destitute, offering food, shelter, and spiritual comfort to those in need. But even this option was not without its challenges. Many religious orders were selective in who they admitted, and homeless people often had to meet strict criteria in order to be accepted. They might be required to demonstrate their piety and devotion, or to have a sponsor who could vouch for their character. Once admitted, life in a religious order was far from easy. Monks and nuns were expected to live lives of poverty, chastity, and obedience, following a strict regimen of prayer, work, and study. For homeless people who were used to a life of freedom and autonomy, this could be a difficult adjustment. But for those who were able to adapt, religious life could offer a sense of purpose and belonging that had been lacking in their previous lives. They might find solace in the rhythms of the liturgy, or in the companionship of their fellow monks and nuns. One such person was a woman named Margaret, who lived in the English town of Norwich in the early 15th century. According to court records from the time, Margaret had been a vagrant and a beggar for much of her life, drifting from town to town in search of alms and shelter. But in 1425, Margaret's life took a dramatic turn when she was taken in by the nuns of the Carrow Abbey in Norwich. The abbey was known for its charitable works, and the nuns there had a reputation for taking in the poor and destitute. Margaret thrived in the structured environment of the abbey, finding a sense of purpose and belonging that had eluded her in her previous life. She took her vows as a nun and devoted herself to a life of prayer and service, caring for the sick and the needy in the abbey's infirmary. But even within the walls of the abbey, Margaret faced challenges and hardships. The life of a nun was not an easy one, and she had to contend with the strict hierarchy and politics of the religious order. Some of her fellow nuns resented her presence, seeing her as a burden on the community's resources. Despite these challenges, Margaret persevered, finding strength in her faith and in the support of those who believed in her. She lived out the rest of her days in the abbey, a testament to the resilience and determination of the human spirit in the face of adversity. As we reflect on the plight of homeless people in medieval times, it is easy to see parallels with the challenges faced by those experiencing homelessness today. While the specific circumstances may have changed, the underlying issues of poverty, social stigma, and lack of access to basic necessities remain all too familiar. In many ways, the story of medieval homelessness is a reminder of the enduring nature of human suffering and the ways in which society often fails those who are most vulnerable. It is a call to action, urging us to do better by those who are struggling and to work towards a world where everyone has a safe and stable place to call home. But it is also a testament to the resilience and strength of the human spirit, even in the face of unimaginable hardship. The stories of people like Matilda, Agnes, John, and Margaret remind us that even in the darkest of times, there is still hope to be found in the kindness of strangers and the power of the human will to survive. As we close this chapter on the history of medieval homelessness, let us take a moment to reflect on the lessons it has to teach us. Let us remember the suffering of those who came before us, and let us use that knowledge to build a better, more compassionate world for all. For in the end, the measure of a society is not in its wealth or its power, but in the way it treats its most vulnerable members. And in that regard, we still have much work to do. As we've seen, the scourge of disease ran rampant through the squalid encampments and hovels where medieval homeless populations clustered. Poor sanitation, malnutrition, exposure to the elements, and crowded, unsanitary living conditions all combined into a perfect storm that left the homeless vulnerable to a grim litany of illnesses and infections that spread like wildfire. Imagine, if you will, a hovel cobbled together from cast-off planks of wood, scraps of cloth, and bundles of straw. Inside, a family of 5 huddles together for warmth, coughing and shivering, their faces gaunt and their eyes glassy with fever. The father's leg oozes pus from an infected cut that stubbornly refuses to heal. The mother cradles a listless infant, trying to coax it to nurse from her breast, but it won't feed. The other children lie still, too weak to cry, their breathing labored and raspy. This is the face of disease among the homeless, a spectre always lurking at the door. One of the most horrific and notorious diseases to stalk the medieval world was the Black Death, the bubonic plague. This pestilence pitilessly scythed through entire towns, leaving behind a gruesome trail of agonizing death. But even more than the general population, this dreaded disease devastated homeless communities. In the year 1348, the Black Death descended upon the English port town of Bristol. As the pestilence raged, the poorest homeless residents found themselves trapped in a nightmarish landscape of suffering and death. With cruel irony, the same societal neglect and indifference that left them destitute now sealed their doom. On the outskirts of Bristol, in a ramshackle camp along the River Avon, a community of homeless families and beggars struggled to survive even in the best of times. But as the plague infiltrated their ranks, it tore through the camp like hellfire. One by one, people fell ill, their bodies ravaged by fever, their lymph nodes swelling into grotesque buboes, and their skin blackening with the trademark necrosis of the plague. The reek of sickness and the wails of the dying filled the air. Within a week, over half the camp had succumbed. Family members were forced to drag the rapidly mounting corpses of their loved ones to a neighboring field for unceremonious mass burial. A few tried to flee the death trap of the camp in search of aid, but they were violently driven back, pelted with rocks and shunned like lepers by the terrified townspeople. After all, in the eyes of proper society, these homeless souls were little more than human refuse. Fear trumped compassion. As the plague burned itself out, the camp lay silent, a ghost town bearing mute witness to the merciless culling of the homeless. Piles of bones and rags marked the spots where whole families met their end. The few shell-shocked survivors wandered amid the gruesome debris of lives cut short, homeless once more. This is just one chilling snapshot of how epidemics ravaged destitute populations. Beyond the infamous Black Death, waves of other contagions ceaselessly assailed the medieval homeless, including dysentery, typhus, influenza, tuberculosis, smallpox, and a host of festering skin diseases. Malnutrition and the lack of proper hygiene weakened their natural defenses, leaving them ripe targets for every plague and pestilence imaginable. In the 14th century, a virulent outbreak of St. Anthony's fire, a fungal disease contracted from eating rye bread contaminated with ergot, swept through France. This ruthless sickness caused skin to erupt in blisters, blacken, and rot away while inflicting excruciating burning pain and driving sufferers to writhe in agony. Among the homeless who subsisted on begged bread scraps, St. Anthony's fire spread with particular cruelty. With no recourse to medical care, they could only pray for a swift end as the infection consumed their limbs. Even relatively minor illnesses that a person of means could recover from routinely snuffed out homeless lives. A simple cut could lead to a raging infection and ultimately claim a limb or a life without proper treatment. A bout of food poisoning from tainted arms could fatally sap the strength of an already frail homeless person. The spectre of disease loomed as a constant and implacable foe. And perhaps worst of all, the visible marks and stench of disease that clung to so many homeless people further deepened the revulsion and contempt the general population felt toward them. They were vilified as unclean, their maladies taken as outward manifestations of inner corruption and deficiency. The sight of a hacking, pustule-covered beggar was enough to make most cross to the other side of the street. This stigma left the homeless shunned, despised, and cast out all the more harshly from society. A wicked catch-22 that ensured their continued suffering. In an era of poor medical understanding, when even the privileged fell victim to the ravages of disease, the homeless were dealt the cruelest hand, bearing the brunt of every contagion that blighted the land. For them, illness was just one more wretched complication in the daily struggle to survive, an ever-present threat waiting to drag them to an unmarked pauper's grave. This was the ugly reality behind the prim facade of medieval society, a world where for the crime of poverty, the homeless paid with their very lives, felled by the indifferent scythe of disease. Such was the fragility and precarity of life on the medieval streets. While the spectre of disease hung heavy over the homeless, they also found themselves subjected to very human cruelties. The social stigma, scorn, and persecution heaped upon them by mainstream medieval society. The plight of the homeless was seen not as a problem to be solved with compassion, but as a moral failure and an affront to the sensibilities of decent people. The prevailing attitude in the Middle Ages cast poverty and homelessness as deserved consequences of idleness, vice, and sin. To be without hearth and home was taken as an outward sign of inner lack and deficiency. Homeless people were routinely denounced as dissolute wastrels, shiftless good-for-nothings, and threats to the moral order. This contempt and blame seeped into every aspect of how the homeless were treated. Imagine the hostile glares and disdainful curled lips that greeted their approaches. Picture the protective way a passerby might clutch their purse and hurry along when a beggar held out a pleading hand. Even children absorbed the attitudes of their elders, shouting taunts, and sometimes throwing rocks or offal at any homeless person who crossed their path. This widespread revulsion frequently boiled over into very real persecution and cruelty. It was considered a jest in some quarters to pelt vagrants with rotten vegetables and refuse. With depressing regularity, gangs of young toughs would set upon lone homeless individuals, beating them senseless for sport. The law might turn a blind eye or deem such abuse as warranted chastisement of the indolent poor. One particularly wrenching historical account from the 14th century London tells of a homeless man named John Hundredpound. As his name suggests, John was no stranger to hardship and lean times. On a chilly autumn day in 1347, John was seized by a mob, beaten until he was half dead, and bodily dragged to the stocks in the town square, where he was locked in and left on display like a caged animal. For hours, John suffered the jeers, curses, and a hail of rotten produce from the townspeople. His head hung low in shame. The ignominy of his cruel treatment was compounded by the fact that the pious John was known as a gentle soul who frequently swept the steps of the church and weeded its gardens in exchange for meagre alms, a detail which did nothing to soften the hearts of his tormentors that day. Only when the church sexton took pity and unilaterally freed John from the stocks did the abused man escape with his life. John £100's story was far from exceptional. The belief that homeless people deserved not just scorn but active punishment was deeply entrenched. Nor was the persecution of the homeless merely the province of private citizens. It was enshrined in law and public policy as well. Harsh statutes against vagrancy and begging were a ubiquitous fact of life. In 1349, King Edward III of England passed the Ordinance of Labourers, which outlawed giving alms to able-bodied vagrants and required them to accept any work offered, no matter how menial the labour or meagre the pay, under penalty of imprisonment. Similar poor laws throughout Europe criminalised homelessness in substance, if not in name. Towns and cities would regularly organise beggar raids to round up and expel their homeless population, driving them out with clubs and whips like so much human chaff. In some locales, repeat offenders who dared to return could face branding, flogging, or having an ear cut off. The perverse irony of punishing people for the crime of having nowhere else to go was utterly lost on the powers that be. This pattern of stigma and persecution only perpetuated the cycle of homelessness. Pushed to the margins, denied access to gainful labour, deprived of alms, and with no resources to better their lot, the homeless had little chance of clawing their way to self-sufficiency. The more ragged and wretched they appeared, the deeper the disgust and hostility they evoked, and the further their prospects of a lifeline diminished. It was a bitter closed loop. Of course, not every homeless person suffered abuse to the same degree. Much depended on an individual's particular circumstances. Homeless women and children generally evoked more sympathy, but that sympathy was always tempered with suspicion about their moral character. Elderly beggars or those with visible disabilities were less likely to be denounced as indolent, and thus had more success garnering alms. But no homeless person was ever entirely free from the taint of social stigma. In a world without a meaningful social safety net, where poverty was deemed a personal failing and undesirables could be driven off and discarded at will, homelessness itself was seen as a kind of social leprosy, a mark of shame and otherness. For those who bore that mark, abuse and indignity were never far away. The clouds of judgment and ostracism that swirled around the homeless made their material hardships all the more bitter and daunting to bear. The message was clear. In the eyes of society, they were despised outcasts, their presence an affront, their needs a nuisance, their suffering warranted. It's hard to imagine a crueler twist of the knife for those already wounded by fate and circumstance. But even in the face of such relentless stigma and persecution, the homeless found small ways to assert their humanity and take solace where they could. Some banded together for protection and camaraderie, forming tight-knit communities of necessity on the margins of society. Others sought escape in whatever meagre creature comforts came their way: a scrap of bread, a sip of ale, a fleeting moment of rest in the sun. And some, as we'll explore next, sought refuge of another kind, the promise of a higher purpose and a roof over their heads within the walls of religious orders. For in a world so hostile to their very existence, the call of a cloistered life, even with all its rigours and restrictions, beckoned as a port in the storm for those weary of being tossed upon fortune's cruel waves. But as we'll see, even this hope of haven was not always what it seemed. In the unremittingly harsh landscape of medieval homelessness, the prospect of finding shelter and succour within the walls of a monastery or convent could seem like a glimmering oasis, a beacon of hope for those drowning in desperation. After all, the Christian teachings that permeated medieval society extolled charity, mercy, and succor of the poor as cardinal virtues. Surely, if anywhere, the homeless could expect compassion and refuge at the door of a religious order. And indeed, for a lucky subset of the homeless, particularly those of a spiritual bent, taking holy orders offered a path off the streets and into a lifelong roof over their heads. By dedicating themselves to a life of religious service, they could trade the gnawing insecurity and privations of homelessness for the stability of the cloister. But this was far from an easy remedy available to all. Religious orders could be highly selective, often requiring evidence of literacy, a dowry, or noble birth for admittance. For male homeless persons, a monastery might demand proof they were free of debt or criminal entanglements. Female applicants to a convent were subject to stringent examination of their virtue and purity. The way was far from universally open. Imagine, though, the profound relief and gratitude of those homeless souls who, against the odds, found themselves admitted to the rolls of a religious community. Picture a weather-beaten, half-starved man, his rags exchanged for the simple but sturdy robe of a monk, his belly full of plain but hearty fare from the refectory table, his head resting on an actual pillow as he drifts to sleep in his own cell for the first time in years. That is the balm of security that admission to an order offered. Of course, they would quickly learn that such security came at its own steep price. The rules and restrictions governing monastic life were ironclad and all-encompassing. Personal autonomy had to be relinquished utterly in service to the order's higher purpose. Days were ruled by a rigid schedule of prayer, work, study, and contemplation, with scarcely a moment unclaimed. The Benedictine order, for example, divided the day into a precisely regimented series of 8 canonical hours, each marked by its own particular devotional offices and labours. To rise before dawn for matins, to pray 5 times in the course of a day, to eat only at prescribed times and places, to toil in gardens and scriptoria for hours on end in between. This was the shape and substance of cloistered life. Nor was it a path for the faint of spirit. The ascetic strain in medieval Christianity, particularly acute in monastic practice, cast deprivation and mortification of the flesh as holy necessities. One might trade the involuntary hardship of the streets for the voluntary hardship of fasting, flagellation, and arduous toil. A poignant 13th century account from a Bavarian convent tells the story of Agnes, a homeless woman who, after a harrowing near-death experience with the sweating sickness, resolved to dedicate her life to God as a nun. But Agnes quickly discovered that her new vocation was no gentle refuge. The agonies of her homeless existence were replaced by the rigours and self-abnegations expected of a bride of Christ. Each night, Agnes and her sister nuns were required to rise from their straw pallets to pray for 2 hours before the matins bell even tolled. They subsisted on a meagre daily ration of coarse black bread, pottage and small beer. The skin on Agnes's knees grew thick as calluses from kneeling on the stone floor of the chapel for hours each day. Her body ached from unaccustomed toil in the convent's fields and from the lashes of the whip when she fell short of perfect obedience. Even speaking more than a few words felt foreign after years of boisterous begging. And yet, for all its hardships, the convent gave Agnes 2 precious gifts that a homeless existence never could: a sense of belonging and a higher purpose. Within those austere walls, she found the human dignity of having a place and a role. The deprivations of cloistered life, as extreme as they could be, were at least imbued with sacred meaning. A poor bargain, perhaps, but preferable to the hollow agonies of the streets. Agnes's story illustrates the bittersweet reality of the religious life for those fleeing homelessness. It was an escape, but one that came at the steep cost of nearly every personal liberty. A constrained, regimented, and ascetic existence, but an existence with structure, status, and spiritual rewards that life on the margins of society could never provide. Of course, not every homeless person who sought succor with a religious order found their way to a permanent vocation. For most, the church was a source of more transient charity. Monasteries, convents, and local parishes were key players in the patchwork of almsgiving that could mean the difference between sustenance and starvation. On the steps of a cathedral, one might find a queue of the destitute waiting for the monks to distribute bread, pottage, and pennies, a custom known as the dole. During holy days and festivals, it was common for the church to sponsor feasts for the poor, laying out what meagre largesse they could spare to nourish both body and soul. For those accustomed to subsisting on the leavings of the marketplace, such outpourings of ritual generosity were a godsend, sometimes literally. Yet even these acts of charity were rarely free of moral judgment. The worthy poor, those who could demonstrate their piety, their infirmity, or their earnest efforts to find work, were given preference over those deemed idle or dissolute. Beggars who positioned themselves near churches and shrines, praying ostentatiously and invoking the saints, could play upon the piety of the faithful to garner alms. The right balance of objection and devotion was crucial. But woe betide those homeless who failed to perform the role of the humbly grateful suppliant. Any hint of entitlement or expectation could quickly sour the church's charity, nor was the bounty of the church. As we've seen, the plight of the homeless in medieval times was a grim and unforgiving existence. Shunned by society, left to fend for themselves in a world with no safety net or sympathy, they eked out a meagre living on the fringes, their lives constantly beset by hunger, cold, disease, and persecution. It's a history that's difficult to confront, but one that still echoes in our modern world. Even today, homelessness remains a tragic and persistent issue in many of our cities and towns. While we've made some progress in providing services and support, the fundamental stigma and struggle endures. The makeshift camps, the daily search for food and shelter, the vulnerability to illness and violence. These are realities that would be all too familiar to the medieval homeless. It's easy to feel disconnected from this history, to imagine it as a distant and alien world. But the truth is, the homeless of the Middle Ages were not so different from those who still live on our streets today. They were mothers and fathers, sons and daughters, each with their own story of hardship and misfortune. They were human beings, deserving of compassion and dignity, no matter their circumstances. Perhaps in learning about their struggles, we can find a renewed empathy for those who face homelessness in our own time. Perhaps we can recognize that this is not a new problem born of modern ills, but an ancient injustice that has plagued humanity for centuries. And perhaps, armed with that knowledge, we can work towards a future where no one is left without a place to call home. As we close this journey through the harrowing history of medieval homelessness, let us hold in our hearts those who suffered in centuries past, and those who continue to suffer today. Let us strive to build a world of greater compassion and care for all. And let us never forget the hard truths of the past, for they light the way forward. And now, the story gently comes to rest. Thank you for spending this quiet time with me here on the Sleepy History channel. Together, we've wandered through echoes of the past, listening to stories that time nearly forgot. If this journey brought you a sense of calm, you're welcome to subscribe or leave a gentle like. It's a small signal that helps these whispered histories continue drifting through the night. If there's a story, a place, or a forgotten age you'd like to explore in the future, feel free to leave it in the comments below. I always enjoy reading where you're listening from, and your words often guide where our next journey begins. On your screen, you'll see another story waiting for you, a quiet path chosen for this moment. If it calls to you, allow yourself to drift into another passage of time. Until we wander together again, rest well, dream softly, and remember, even the past deserves to sleep. Good night.